Bahum sahasramabhinnita sayudantam girimekhalam mudita ghorasasena-maram danadidam navidhina.
Many longtime listeners know that our podcast platform was initially focused on interviews about the many spiritual paths that Myanmar offers meditators and monastics. But when the coup hit, we couldn't in good conscience continue to tell those stories with many monastic sites on fire or occupied by soldiers, and the Burmese people living under the military's ongoing reign of terror. So we expanded our mission to cover a wider range of post-coup Myanmar stories. Still, some guests have a unique insight into the intersection of the spiritual with the worldly, allowing a deeper understanding of both planes. Today's guest squarely fits in that category, as you'll soon hear. Gustaaf Houtman, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
There's so much to get into with you, and it's just, this is a particularly thrilling episode and interview for me. You've had such an illustrious academic career and activist career as well, but you know, I want to start to focus this conversation on really what's a hidden gem, which is your 1990 thesis, Traditions of Buddhist Practice in Burma. I'm sure through this piece we'll get into so many others, and it will link to your current work and your life and other parts of your academic career. But I want to, before we get into this, I just want to highlight just how truly unique and singular this particular thesis is, especially for meditators. And for those meditators listening, I think there's some that may have found it, and it's this hidden gem that is unlike anything that's ever come before or after it, and what you do in charting the pati-pati or some of the practice lineages in Burma, and just the really unprecedented research that you did in the 1980s in doing that. I can say, you know, honestly, for years, probably well over a decade, this is a conversation I have been waiting and eager to have, and to be able to have it on a platform like this where others can listen in. That's really a thrill. But I also want to call attention for those listening that come from a meditation tradition, foreign meditators, Burmese meditators, Buddhists that do not know of this thesis being only a thesis and only available some corners of the online sphere. I want to really highlight and call attention to how incredible this is, and how so many of the insights and things that you find are not available that I've seen anywhere else but in this thesis. And so many Buddhist scholars link back to this thesis that I really just want to underscore and highlight for those to track this down and to read it themselves, because we're barely going to do justice to how much you put in there and bring to that. So I want to foreground the conversation in calling out the nature of what you did in 1990. And with that, let's get into some of what you uncover. And I think as we start the conversation, I was thinking perhaps the best way to get into this is to set the context and the scene, because you're conducting, so this comes out in 1990, you're conducting the research in the early 1980s, Ne Win's regime, you speak fluent Burmese, very unusual to be able to have that kind of permission and access that you had. But before getting into your work, I think it might be relevant to ground the work of not just Burmese studies, but Burmese Buddhist studies that had happened up to that point, and some of the other scholars Western scholars that had come, and maybe Burmese scholars that had done work prior to you, because some of their perspectives and their work started to shape, or we could say misshape, some of the understandings of practice and doctrine at that time. So if perhaps you can start with telling us what the understanding of the field was prior to the time that you started to do your work.
Yes, I think probably what distinguishes my work, perhaps in relation to some of the other work that came later, is that I'm not primarily a Buddhologist or a textual scholar in the Pali or Sanskrit tradition. So I'm not an Indologist. I began simply as an anthropologist from the ground up after learning the language in the late 70s. And so I approached the whole topic through Burmese and also through grassroots connections in society. And that meant that my motivation to study it wasn't baked in. I didn't begin my Burmese studies to study Vipassana. It happened because the people I encountered happened to have a real interest in Vipassana, and those were my hosts. So it is not that I come from outside with an interest in Vipassana. I come from the inside with an interest in Vipassana. Why do Burmese themselves put such an emphasis on Vipassana, especially given the times that they have difficulties? And so I was interested in the idea that Vipassana becomes popular at times almost of crises of various kinds, economic, political, and other kinds of crises. So it's not what often a foreigner coming to Myanmar is, trying to look for, which is some kind of holy grail of spiritual knowledge that will make them complete. Of course, the foreigners themselves have crises, and they end up in Myanmar, and then they end up having some kind of search for something that will complete their lives. But for the Burmese, generally, it's much more like a regular touchstone of reality, of a reality that goes beyond the everyday world that they're in, which is pretty difficult to live in. If you look at it from the period of 62 onwards, that world is very complicated and very incomplete, and always behind the rest of the world. So one could say that even with the coup now, we are in a similar situation again, and we are put back again into that situation. Now probably much worse. I mean, I would say this is the worst time we've ever had. I haven't seen anything like this since 2021. So my interest in Vipassana then was my host, and in particular, I was staying with a librarian from Rangoon University, and she has died now quite a long time ago. But she was a great supporter and of great assistance to me. And she had her relatives, in particular her father, who was a meditator of a particular kind. So he wanted to be a Weikza and was a little bit confused in life, and she was trying to put him straight. So she would send him to the Mahasi Center so that his behavior would become a little bit more normal. So he had lots of issues, like there was a real he had a mental illness, as did her mother. And for her, the solution for this was for them to practice Vipassana, to restore their balance in life, and to live a normal life. So there were lots of arguments within the family, and there were some who supported him going to the Vipassana center, and then some who felt, yeah, it would be good, but they were a little bit uncommitted. But mostly they supported for the father to go there. And she herself did several retreats. So as I was in that household, I was brought into this reality of Vipassana as a solution for Burmese families, as a sort of almost like a therapeutical moment. But I was also acutely aware that there are many types of meditation, and that the Vipassana center, the Weikza as it were, is only one kind, and that there are many other kinds of meditation that do not fit in the center, but are actually kept out, like the samatha traditions and the Lokipanya traditions and those kind of meditation. They are not seen as appropriate because they are not leading to nibbana, ultimately, but also not to resolve the problems that this person has, because this person was practicing Teyat techniques. So, like, he had built a pagoda, the father, or repaired a pagoda, and then became mentally ill, ultimately, by encountering various Weikzas during his meditation. And these Weikzas were arguing with one another, and there was an Indian Weikza, and then there was a Burmese Weikza, and they were arguing with one another, and who was more powerful than the other. So he saw all those things, which are linked to the Weikza tradition and the samatha tradition.
These are supernatural beings.
Supernatural beings, yeah. And he experienced them, so he would sit down, and I would come down from my room, and I was living on the top floor. I would come down, and he would be sitting there in front of the Buddha statue, and he would be meditating his technique, which was... Then he would confront all these disagreements, which made him mentally ill. Right, so I was puzzled, because I saw that there were some traditions that had never been described really fully in the literature, and that we generally call tamatha. And that actually the meanings of meditation are so broad that Vipassana is just one particular take. Of course, a very specific one, which leads to release from rebirth, which leads to overcoming lots of anguish and emotions, and it's more therapeutical. But the samatha techniques are there to bolster somebody's feeling of power, and perhaps even make them rich, because often it's associated with richesse, which allow them to control the world, right? And that aim to control the world is totally opposite to the Vipassana aim.
Yeah.
And so I encountered those just in one family. The first family that I was I stayed at other families before that, during my visit in the 70s. And there I didn't see as much of that in Mandalay, for example. But I was already staying with that family even in the 70s, the late 70s. And so I became aware of that diversity. And I was puzzled, because when you read a treatise on meditation, or bhavana, or kamatan, it's also specific and so clear. These are the terminologies. This is how it is. But when you come to the ground of the Burmese experience, it is so varied, and people make of it what they want.
Right.
And so, it being so experiential, it's such a broad canvas of meanings that I was surprised that as an anthropologist looking at it, the diversity is so much greater than the books describing it.
Right, and this is, we can tie in Mendelssohn and Spiro, if you might give some background as to what the Western understanding was through them, and maybe some others as you came into it.
Yeah, I mean, Mendelssohn was he was puzzled by some of these Gaings, the Gaing Gana, right? So those are mainly kind of the Weikza Gaings. And I think he also didn't know where to go with it, because he discovered them, and then they were linked to kings to be, and to powerful beings, and then hierarchy. And so he was puzzled and excited by finding these. But obviously, when we look at 62, Ne Win was in no mood to allow any supernatural kings or beings to assert themselves. And so samatha was very quickly out of bounds. So they were kind of forbidden, like many other things were forbidden. But supernatural quests by human beings, they cause instability. Think of the Sāsana uprising in the 1930s. It took the army, the British to take the army from India to quell it. So strong was it. But that was, again, based on a similar idea, which is how do you gain power through meditation or through exercise, mental exercises. So, sure, Ne Win saw that, and he wasn't going to allow any samatha traditions to evolve unless they were serving the military ends. So, largely they were forbidden. Any of these Weikza cults were repressed. And so, Mendelssohn was just prior to Ne Win, right? So he just saw some of the manifestations, which were later snuffed out for the most part. You may have had some latent ones and some hidden ones, as I also encountered, but those were mostly not given any form, public form, right? Because if they did, they would be arrested, right? They would be repressed. So in that sense, I think Mendelssohn was there at that time. Now, Spira was also there at that time. He also noted some of those, but he decided that the Burmese were mostly Kamatic, and they were not enough Nibbanic for him. So he said the Burmese are surprising because they go against the canon, and they're not actually meditating very much. That was very surprising, because if you look at Burma, it was a much more engaged in Vipassana traditions and also meditation traditions than one would say about Sri Lanka, than they were. In Sri Lanka, the traditions weren't as strong as they were in Burma, as in the case of Thailand. And one could question why is Vipassana, or why are these meditation traditions so strong in Burma? And that is a question that I think you could look at, and there are historical reasons for that. Colonialism, at a particular time, kingship unfulfilled, snuffed out, and then certain monks ending up changing their teachings, changing their practices, largely in the shadow of colonialism. Yes, so that has its own sort of historical trajectory, which explains why now Vipassana is still so important in the country. But it changes with political regimes. If the political regime changes, and then Vipassana changes. And that's very interesting. The Unu was Mahasi, dry insight. Mm-hmm. But that lasted during the Ne Win period because it's very happy. Everybody is very quiet. Nobody's picking up guns. Everybody is withdrawing into themselves. Uh-huh. It's a very happy way of having a socialist Lansing. Uh-huh. So Ne Win was quite happy to let them do that. And then when he retired, he actually started to make these motions that he was, if only he had known about Tohlanye, about the spiritual revolution, he would have not committed the socialist revolution, but he would have been more interested in the Vipassana trajectory of it. But he only did it after his retirement.
What
right?
tradition did he practice?
Well, there are questions over whether he practiced anything at all. But he adopted the discourse in his retirement that he was actually interested in Ledi Sayadaw at that point.
Really?
And he admitted to Uche Laing, who was the ideological sort of deviser of the socialist Lansing. He said to him, if only I had known, because about a few years, quite a few years after he had left. he admitted to him that he would not have committed the socialist revolution.
Meaning the coup.
The coup.
Yeah, and this is to refresh listeners who may not know all this background. Ne Win is the military leader who in 1962 initiated the coup, which Burma is still suffering from today. And so there's just so much embedded information in this. It's hard to emphasize how incredible this all is. So Ne Win institutes the coup in 1962. He is uncomfortable at that time with the higher concentration and absorption practices with the Weikza tradition, but is comfortable with Mahasi, which is a kind of withdrawing inwards into silent meditative retreats and the dry insight. And I'll prompt you in a moment to explain what the dry insight, dry Vipassana tradition is. But then while he's still alive and when he withdraws from basically being a dictator, he then describes, at least in discourse, his impressions and his how he's been influenced by reading the writings of Ledi Sayadaw and suggesting that he may not have initiated a coup or may have led differently had he undergone a inner spiritual revolution through Ledi's works. And earlier, right? And here I'll prompt you to then flesh out and unpack a little bit more what is meant by the dry versus wet Vipassana traditions and how what this means first from the point of view of a meditator, and then here is where the lay meditation tradition becomes so important of how these fit in, but then segueing from that into what the political ramifications are of dry versus wet.
Before we go to this idea of dry versus mixed meditation, Vipassana, I think we should just stick for a moment to this idea that those who are in authority, when they retire, they have to somehow leave their office. And during their office, they have control over Loka, over the whole domain, right? So Ne Win left his office, and actually his daughter Sandawin described him as spending most of his time in his extensive library studying Buddhist sutras and meditating to control his own destiny. That was after retirement, right? Of course, it's not that he did a lot of Vipassana there, but he rediscovered the Ledi Sayadaw, and he rediscovered the idea of a revolution as being of a different kind. And so he actually did admit to Uchet Line that he would have committed a different kind of revolution. Now, today we still have the consequences of the 62 coup. I mean, this coup of 2021, it's not the same kind of coup. It's in a different environment, different economic environment, but different political environment. But the army has continued to keep control. But what we have here is we have this tradition of distancing yourself from your past. So the generals are generally doing that. And when I went to the Mahasi Center for the first time in 82-83, I met U Tin U. U Tin U was the general under Ne Win who didn't shoot at the students and then was fired. So he shouted at me, and I thought, it sounds like a general. He was dressed as a monk at the Mahasi Center. And I said, ooh, he sounds like a general. And then I got to know him, and then I got to visit his house, and I saw Moshe Dayan with him in one picture, because he had received training and so forth in Israel and so forth. So he became the secretary of the NLD, Putin, right? But he was a former general. So what you find is all the former generals, they all have to find a way out of their predicament. Yeah. They're imprisoned in the Loka, the world that they created, which is a very heavy-handed, almost impossible to live in world. So when they retire, they have to find a way out. And what do? They turn towards Buddhism, and especially they turn towards meditative traditions. And so that kind of is a technique which divides the army from the people who are the reformers. If you look at the Burmese history, the reformers have tended to emphasize Vipassana. Going back to Upo Line under Mindo, right?
You're talking 19th century here.
Yeah, talking about 1800s,
Yeah,
1850s, 1860s. So the reformers have always been on that side, but then the generals or those who are in power join them after their office is over,
And they accumulate enough bad karma.
and they've accumulated enough bad karma, but they pretend, of course, that they are innocent and that they have converted to a totally different way of life.
Yeah.
They're no longer killing people, but they are now looking for a real spiritual revolution of their own.
This is where that Burmese character from George Orwell's Burmese Days becomes so prescient, I would say.
Yes. So that's, I just wanted to say that because it's so pertinent. We are living today in a world where we could never have imagined the amount of cruelty that one army can inflict on its own people. So, that moment will generate equally responses from all the every different language group, ethnic group, every different kind of religion that is in Myanmar has to find a response to that, some solace, some sort of help, that's very difficult to respond to, that kind of violence.
Yeah.
So this is where I think, from my point of view, my scholarship kind of ends a little bit. Not ends, but I feel you can only do so much with scholarship at a time of distress.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So...
If I could then prompt you back towards that early scholarship and where we left off in 1962, where we're looking at how there was a drive, a passion, a movement which coincided with being conducive to Ne Win's dictatorship. So it was kind of the perfect storm of its of this taking off. So if you can, and this also would lead to 20 years later you coming and witnessing what had happened in those 2 decades. So if you can take us on first unpack again from the political aside, but looking at it from the Buddhist and especially the lay Buddhist point of view. What is this drive Vipassana and why is it significant and practical and useful for how it's being applied? And then come into how it also ended up maybe accidentally serving the needs of a military dictatorship.
Well, if you read the biography of UNU, you understand that UNU was a big supporter. That's at national independence, 1948. UNU instituted the Mahasi, as it were, through the Bodha-batha Nuga Association. And so, I think he saw, there's this comment about how he had big earlobes, he had big hands and certain features, certain physical features that would have made him a very influential and major figure in teaching Buddhism to the population. Right, he would have been a good figure. So he was considered to be the ideal teacher, and so under UNU there were many hundreds of meditation centers established in the Mahasi tradition all over the country, and very successful. But the method is a little bit more, is a bit longer than the method that, for example, Ba Khin has, which he's reduced to 10 days. Specifically for lay people to practice. So the Mahasi technique that doesn't suit everyone, and so although it was set as the ideal, and it mainly emphasized crossing over to Vipassana as soon as you can, meaning don't keep on going into the samatha methods and think that you can get the jhanas before you go over to Vipassana. So the dry Vipassana technique basically is to cut short your samadhi and just use it in order to cross over to Vipassana, but don't stay in it and don't take it any further than it needs to go, because it's distracting from the ultimate aim of attaining Nibbana, right? So in that sense, that message was one of purity over power. And if we think about the samatha traditions, they are almost invariably about power. You internalize an image and you strengthen it, you can call it up, you can purify it at will. And that willpower to make it visible and appear at the moment that you want it, that image, suggests that we all know that in Buddhism the powers come with samatha, with the jhanas, the power of flight, the power of distant vision, the power of almost every kind of power that you could have, come with samatha. So the samatha traditions have always been important to people who want to influence the world, like in naked power sense. So U was interested in democracy mostly, really. I mean, he wasn't socialism, but he wasn't really ready to be a dictator as we had in the form of Ne Win, obviously. Ne Win came from the army side. U came from a university education. He wanted to be a writer. He was not there to dictate to the world how it should be, right? So from his point of view, Vipassana was like a much more open and system of enlightenment of the people, but not one of control specifically. Yet, if you think about it, the way he used Vipassana also to bring Buddhism to the outside, to the hills, to Zomya, as it were, was calculated to bring over a lot of the hill tribes and so forth to Buddhism. So we see that it's not entirely void of trying to gain influence over the world, and Vipassana did serve that objective in his program. But for the most part, he didn't see Vipassana as one of gaining power. Now, when socialism was a kind of, towards the end of socialist period, when Ne Win was resigning, and thereafter, we see that suddenly this pure Vipassana technique, which also the military liked because it meant no opposition, no overt movement, so they're going to challenge the army for control, wouldn't arise. So therefore they also were quite happy to let the Mahasi tradition sort of govern the Vipassana traditions, and they would generally be not so tolerant of these samatha traditions, Weikza traditions. So when I was doing my fieldwork there, I wasn't allowed to go to Minbu, for example. Minbu was the place where a lot of Weikzas were practicing, and I was told, go there, you'll find a lot of Weikzas. And I wanted to go there, but I didn't get permission. But then again, I had to get permission for every step I took while I was there during 81, 82, and I had to get permission for every place I visited. In those days, there were not even 7-day visas. So there were very few foreigners except the embassy people. So we clearly they didn't like me to visit a place like that. And there were many black areas that I wasn't allowed to go to at all, obviously. So I came through the Department of Religious Affairs, Home and Religious Affairs. That gave me more freedom, but I had a colleague who came through the Education Department, and she was imprisoned in the university. She couldn't get out of the university, and I couldn't get into the university because the university didn't allow any people like me because they didn't want anybody coming in from outside. So universities were out of bounds, right? I wasn't meant to be going there. So in that sense, so there were of course so many restrictions when I was doing my fieldwork there, but I could roam freely in the Mandalay and Yangon. I was quite free to go where I wanted, but for any trips I had to give advance notice where I was going to go, and generally there would be some notice taken, and there would be some follow up. What did he say, and who was he meeting, and right? There was an element of suspicion. And at one point also, I went to the Ministry of Religious Affairs, and suddenly there were officers coming in with a little hat, with sort of officer, like intelligence people, obviously, and there was some kind of consternation that I had given my my abode when I wasn't in Yangon. Bob Taylor was visiting Myanmar, and I'd given my place of stay when I was in Mandalay to him, just in case he wanted to stay there. And that's when they began to investigate me, because I hadn't put anything for religion, and was I maybe a communist? Because he met Ne Win, right? And he then wrote the famous book.
Yeah, infamous. We could say.
Book on the yeah. So yeah, there were moments of clear evidence of government intervention, as if any foreigner is like potentially very dangerous in those days, right? But even now, I think potentially foreigners are dangerous, and yeah, I mean, one can understand it. I'm not saying I don't understand it, but what I mean to say is that when you visit to do scholarship and you feel that the community that you are interacting with, that on your back comes the security apparatus whenever you talk to anybody, that is a very difficult feeling. So when in 2015 suddenly this pressure disappeared because there was a civilian government, and that's finally after, after 40, 30, 35 years, I could go into the country without feeling that I was bringing in that luggage of that repressive apparatus. And so that's when I could join in. So that's when I started to teach at Mandalay University. I could go to the university for the first time, and I could be part of a community, and I could be without that apparatus at my back. And so that was a moment for 5 years that I volunteered to teach, and I spent about half the 5 years. So every 3 months I would be in Mandalay and teach as much as I could at Poundo U, at the Mandalay University, and I would also do a little bit of field work. But my biggest interest was to be part of the community and contribute, which I could never before do. Certainly not at university level. So for me that was an amazing opportunity, which then was cut short in 2021 and COVID 2020.
Yeah.
So then I took it up again, in a sense, here in Thailand. I come back on the same basis and interact with the Burmese refugees who are here.
So then, picking up on the Drive Vipassana traditions that you've described, you then came again a couple of decades after Ne Win took power. So there had been some growth in some of these teachings, teachers, traditions, and in this 1990 thesis, which your research culminated in, you track the intersecting lines of such traditions as you've mentioned, Mahasi, Ba Khin, certainly also Mogok and Soon Lun, among others. And this the messiness of trying to track and figure out pati lineages. I mean, this is like herding cats. This is I would say I perhaps I did something similar in your footsteps, not in an academic sense, but in a more driven more by curiosity and mapping, where during the transition period after I had lived there for years, I worked on what I called a meditator's guidebook, where we had a lot of foreign meditators now able to come more freely. And the level of ignorance and misunderstanding and attempt to navigate, a lot of people who really wanted to genuinely practice a spiritual tradition, but just had such a difficult time knowing how do you behave in a monastery, and which teacher teaches what, and what is connected to what are the lineages, what are the practices, the instructions. What is the difference between, Pa'ok and Upandita at that time? And so I was trying to do a bit of the mapping, more than a bit. I spent years trying to figure out that mapping during the 2010s. And so I can personally attest to, just the extreme messiness of trying to figure out what's in front of you and then trying to describe it. You're doing it in an academic sense with this conducting field work, interviews, and then putting it together for a thesis that it all comes to. So let's get back into that field work that you did in the 80s, tracking these different Pāti-Pāti lineages and the culminating thesis that comes. There's more in that thesis than we can fit into this conversation, but share some thoughts or insights that comes up from that work that you did.
Yes, I think probably the way to think about it is, what was it? The tradition of practice is like a rolling bird. It kind of jumps and it's not traceable.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that and this again goes back to the original idea that I try to get across, which is when you read a book about meditation, every term is clarified. The terminology is huge. And you think, whoa, this must be a huge system. Where everybody knows exactly where they stand. And but actually, the tradition goes forth through pariyati, in a sense, through scriptural learning tradition. Scriptural learning tradition is the one that does ordination and that sets the teacher-pupil lineage clear. And then the meditation tradition is when some of them go across to another teacher and they find that they get some practical instructions. And that is not easily documented as a tradition. Because, okay, there will then be memories of who had which pupils and what they did, etc. But mostly the pariyati tradition is very easy to trace because there's documentation. And it's very clear what has to happen. There's an ordination ceremony. There's certain kinds of rules that you have to follow before you can take them. But for the Pāti-Pāti tradition, it is actually as if it continuously ceases with the life of the teacher. And then it gets then brought forth in other ways by the pupils who have their own traditions. So the question is whether there is a lineage that runs right across. And it is really like the rolling bird. It's actually jumping up and down. And it's very difficult to trace. And the pupils go into all sorts of directions. And they're not necessarily sanctioned in any obvious way. In the Pariyat lineage is very clear. If you ordain a student, you have to teach them particular suttas, particular texts. But what is it in the meditation tradition? Well, it's up to the teacher. And it's up to the experiences that they have jointly have, which are very difficult to document, right? So in that sense, we could say that the practice traditions are continuously discontinuous.
Wow.
And that they are, we see that how desperate Ba Khin was to manufacture a lineage with the Webu Sayadaw. He went out of his way to do it.
I would just jump in there and question to what degree was that relation with Webu a desire on his part to manufacture a lineage, and to what degree was it to get, how I would describe it more as wanting to get the approval of a very esteemed monk, because that approval and permission and validation is very different from what I would call lineage, which is what we'll get into in a moment, which is what I would say Goenka was very desperate and desirous to do. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that is true. But then again, if I now study the bodha-batha, bodha-batha are the ritual specialists in Mandalay who do shimbyu and marriages. And they also have a lineage. And lineage is something that you put up front. So if you see a picture of a bodha-batha, they often have a small picture of their teacher on top, in the corner. Student of, pupil of. In Burma, this teacher-pupil tradition is very strong. You cannot really teach or do anything without it. And so in that sense, if you don't have a recognized teacher, people will question where you got your knowledge from. So for Ba Khin as a layperson, clearly, it was very important for him to establish continuity with the past. Where did he get his knowledge from? Where did he get his teachings from? If he did not demonstrate that he had a teacher who was on top form, ordained ideally, because that is how you document a lineage, Just a practitioner lineage is a little bit difficult because it could be questioned, like, okay, so what did you do with your teacher? What did you really do? Well, in the ordination lineage, it's very easily documented.
Yeah.
There's a clear historical record of your ordination, but that record is very vague when it comes to encountering a teacher for meditation.
But Webu validated Ba Khin. He didn't necessarily teach him, as far as I understand.
Right. But this shows how important validation is.
Yeah.
Because the Burmese community are not going to trust somebody who just says, I've invented this tradition and this is true Buddhism. I may not have got it from anybody. I thought of it all myself by reading my own books. It looks a bit suspicious to Burmese.
Is that not what Paok said?
Well, that's a good point. Did he? In terms of his meditation tradition, but in terms of his ordination tradition.
Right, of course.
That would have been established without doubt.
Yeah.
But in terms of the meditation tradition, he did reinvent, or at least discover, the samatha methods that under the bare insight traditions were really not considered ideal for the public to practice. So and this also comes in with a new political regime. It's post-socialist. And it's very interesting that when you look at different political regimes, the meditation regimes also change. As a political regime changes, so does the meditation. So under the socialist regime, we had dry Vipassana, and Pa'ao emerged once there was a more military, overt regime.
Although he faced a lot of persecution from that military regime at the start of his teaching.
Exactly, because it's not dry Vipassana. And because it potentially creates opposition.
Yeah.
And what would you do with that opposition? Basically, to the military, everything is opposition. If you're under 18, you're an opponent. If you're anything is opposition.
Yeah.
Even, well, look at what's happening. They're eradicating everybody.
Yeah.
So even a young person is opposition.
Yeah.
So this idea that if it's not dry Vipassana, there is a risk that you get opponents. It's like a manufacturing of autonomous agencies that stand on their own powers.
Although in the Paok tradition, I was bookmarking what you said a bit earlier about how the tamatha tradition is practice is a way not to withdraw but to manifest power. Paok tradition is not teaching that manifestation of power as a way of political challenge or worldly desires or seeking, but is presenting that as a way of classical liberation and on a spiritual path.
Absolutely, I was not in any way suggesting that the Pao method is an opposition method. But if we now take a bigger question, and you think now how Thailand has regarded Vipassana, that for the most part in the early days Vipassana was seen as communist. It was kind of radically questioning hierarchy. And that the Sangha Raja at the time, who went to Mahasi, was arrested. So different political regimes, different meditation regimes. This is what I'm saying. There's a recent book about yoga by an anthropologist who says yoga and power, and that actually yoga is involved in all aspects of power in Indian traditions. So it's kind of by analogy, you could say that these meditative traditions have great effects and they reverberate in the national conscience even. And that when you have a different political regime, you also get a different kind of meditation.
Fascinating.
So in generally, I would say that those who have studied Thai traditions of meditation have seen the dry technique of Vipassana as being slightly unorthodox. And they have their reasons for saying that, because probably if you read all the commentaries and the scriptures, you probably find that the dry Vipassana technique is it's justifiable, but it may not be the most common way of dealing with meditation. And that the Burmese historical case of losing their king and then being at the mercy of a colonial regime led to a particular kind of idea about Vipassana that is unique to its historical trajectory. And that links to the loss of a king. It links to Ledi Sayadaw going out in the forest because when the British come, they will set up abattoirs. They will kill all our capital. The buffaloes that plow our fields. So what are we going to do? So he went into the forest, meditated, and then he came out and he taught this Vipassana tradition to his pupils, who then went on to teach on. And so this then led to ultimately Ba Khin, but also to many others.
Yeah.
So Ledi Sayadaw was a response to colonialism. And it was also, because if you read his biography, it was the very difficult moment that he realized that when the British come, there will be no king to validate scriptural learning and the sacredness of the monks, the good nature, the good teachings of the monks anymore. So they will be out on their own. So he then went into the forest, right? Kind of linked, these two things are linked, right? And in that sense, one could say that Vipassana is the product, or at least meditation tradition generally, as is yoga, of particular political circumstances and historical political circumstances that lead to particular manifestations. And Burma is one manifestation, Sri Lanka is another, and Thailand is another.
But then what's so incredible with that is that these lead to certain manifestations, Vipassana in Burma, yoga in India, which then those forms are picked up and spread around the world and changing far-off societies in ways that we're still seeing.
This is what I myself was so surprised by, because meditation is the most minute act of withdrawal, right, into your experiences, feelings, emotions, whatever you're observing. When we look at the empire, well, the end of the British Empire could be one aspect of the end of the British Empire was the withdrawal of the British Navy from Singapore. There was Rear Admiral Shattock, who wrote 3 books about Vipassana.
He was a Mahasi meditator.
He went to the Mahasi as his office was ending as Rear Admiral of the Navy.
Yeah.
And then so you have this image. There is the empire. The empire is imploding. As it implodes, it takes an interest in spiritual techniques from its colonies, including yoga, but also including Vipassana.
Yeah.
And then the opposite happens, because, of course, Mindommi was at the end of his empire.
This is the 19th century Burmese king.
Yes, whose Minister of the Interior wrote 3 books about Vipassana.
Upolain, yeah.
Upolain. And who wanted to reform government in order to make it suitable to the modern era.
Yeah.
And Timor didn't take that much further, but if it had happened, maybe it would have been a bit like Thailand. They could have accommodated maybe some of the historical developments, but because they did not reform in time like the Japanese did or the Thai did, they ended up with a particular kind of historical trajectory that led to a very different kind of history. So one can say that these techniques are actually more influential than you think. And then, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi doing her Vipassana at a time when she's under house arrest. You can see that Ne Win doing it after he retires, U doing it before he takes power. Because he says, if there are fires, you must put them out yourselves. Yeah. I'm going to meditate.
Yeah.
So this idea that the technique of meditation and Vipassana and so forth, that they have an influence over the political realm, but they're also the product of it.
Incredible.
So you have this duality in there. So it seems the most minute marginalization. Somebody who meditates must be so marginal. Who else would meditate? They could earn millions in this world. But then that moment of that person doing that seems to recreate the entire political order all over again, in some way or another.
And now you have billionaires in the West that are meditating and doing yoga.
There is no institution in the Western world that doesn't take meditation seriously.
Yeah.
Old people's homes, disabled, businessmen trying to improve their... Everything is about meditation.
Corporations, the military.
Corporations. Even getting rid of your stress, your therapy. It is at the heart of the Western civilization now.
And so much of this, one could argue, came from the reformulations that Ledi Sayadaw did in the advance of the British takeover.
Exactly. So the end of one empire leads to the core of the next. And it is almost as if it becomes acultural. And this is a question we can ask about Vipassana, whether it actually sort of transcends culture or diminishes culture. Because if you look at it from a Burmese point of view, during the socialist era, the way that people got to know about other countries was through the monks traveling and teaching Vipassana abroad.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? And so they saw that, and that for them was their connection to the outside world, was through the Vipassana technique.
This was Mahasi and U Pandita primarily.
Yeah, and then also foreigners coming to meditate in Myanmar, and as they spectated that was just for them an immense that was the height of their concept of civilization, or they're coming here for our most valuable tradition.
Yeah,
and they come from all walks of life, and they're giving up their cultures.
Yeah, you still see that to this day. I spent a lot of years living in remote Burmese monasteries and had friends who lived even more remote Burmese monasteries and forests. And we would comment on. I ended up making this analogy that at some point it almost feels like we are the prized Arabian stallions in the stable, in the sense that when we're there, we will be shown off to the visitors coming. If we're in a deep meditative state, even Burmese families will come to look at the foreigner who's meditating, and that will be almost a sign of validation to either that particular monastery or that particular Sayadaw. The supporters thereby also get the benefit that, look, I'm associated with a remote monastery that is drawing this Westerner to want to come and spend time. And so it started to feel like there was a showing offness of the status of this particular site or individual.
I think that's correct. And one might ask whether as a spectator sport, if you think about the concept of theoria or theoroi, theoroi were ambassadors at the sort of the Olympic sports, where all the different groups would come together and they would vie. And then theoria was really the idea of a form of insight you derived from seeing that. So the concept of theory that we have, which is really void of all the things that don't matter. So leave your culture out, leave your religion out, leave everything out. Just concentrate on the facts. The facts is that some are winning and some are losing. So theoria was about spectating this event where the gods favor some but not the others. And through theoria you can distinguish that idea of winning, but it becomes like theory becomes like a way of thinking without the encumberment of your past historical sort of accretions that are totally unnecessary and stop you thinking, right? So theory is so I would say that the Vipassana is a form of theory, a Burmese form of theory, where you can transcend cultural and national differences, and where you can end up in a joint victory of understanding without cultural filters or what we kileta, defilements of your thinking. So in a sense, one can say that our history of theorizing has a very similar kind of trajectory, which is that we don't want to theorize with the wrong thoughts or with the wrong assumptions. We want to purify everything from anything that's unnecessary in order to get to the truth. So in that sense, I would say that Burmese Vipassana is a form of theorizing without the baggage. And this is why it is very much about leaving behind things. And so the multicultural spectatorship that you have with Vipassana, through monks traveling abroad and having pupils accumulating who are taking that teaching, but also foreigners coming into Burma and practicing this technique, that gives joy to the spectators. And for them, it's evidence that there is something to be had that is beyond cultural or religious or doctrinal sort of accretion. Something pure.
That's incredible. And so I also want to get back to, we've described this messiness of the trying to track pati-pati, so-called lineages, the quality of herding cats, the rolling bird analogy that you use. And even as we look at this example of Webu Sayadaw validating Ba Khin, and not so much teaching him, or I would even argue not so much being a lineage, but being a validator that shows that you certainly are qualified to go out and teach. That becomes a big part of how he's able to, at that time, do a somewhat controversial act of being able to set up a lay meditation center and be a lay meditation teacher. But then we get into the case of Goenka, and then we get something very different where Goenka has described this lineage, Ledi Sayadaw to Sayataji to Ba Khin to Goenka, with Webu somewhat of a undefined figure somewhere in there. And it's for those who are outside of knowledge of Burmese Buddhism or Burmese politics or the Vipassana traditions, et cetera, this is a very neat and easy to follow mythology that is presented not just as a straight teacher to pupil relationship, but also as a singular technique that's being, and here's the key word, being preserved and in its pristine purity, as he says, but being preserved and handed down. That's the terminology that's often used. Preserved and handed down, until it's preserved by Goenka and handed down to me as a practitioner, now being able to go to a course in, I don't know, Japan or California or Mexico or any number of other places where it's now offered. And so you get this, I don't know if I want to call it a sanitized version or a reductionist or simplistic, but a neat, it's a very neat and easy and logical version that is in, I think for those listening that could be from or familiar with that tradition, it's that version that is so handed down and accustomed to and talked about, in the public facing description of their tradition as well as on the course, seems at such tremendous odds with the messiness that we're describing now. So how do we come to understand this contrast?
I'm sure that if you had the opportunity and you went to the Ledi Sayadaw and you were taught by him about meditation, it wouldn't have been as easily packaged. It's a pedagogical formula that has been revised and revised and revised and then brought to bear, a bit like a textbook. Like a textbook. If you read a textbook for, let's say, primary school, you say, yeah, this is a textbook. This doesn't really reflect the complexities of anything. It's just for pupils to have a beginning, that they don't have to question what's going on, and they don't have to get confused. So no confusion. But if you were to go to one of these teachers who really know their stuff, and you were to say, well, this is meditation. No, there are so many other factors that would play. So it's a bit like, okay, so you want to learn Thai. So you can say it this way, you can say it that way, you can say it that way. I would say, well, just tell it me one way so that I don't have to get confused when I want to say it. But there are so many other ways that you can say it. And I think that meditation traditions that are currently being taught abroad are very much of that kind. They're the textbook kind. and they do not reflect. They're shorn of the complexities of the, first of all, the language in which the instruction originally was made, the methodologies that were originally opted for, but could have been otherwise. Even the Mahasi taught many methods.
Yeah.
He didn't teach just one method.
Right.
But the way that it's brought out is you have to do it this way, that way, because that's the simplest way to do it. So in that sense, we cannot reduce the tradition or the originators of these traditions to the textbook equivalents.
Yeah.
And certainly, it keeps on evolving. There is no end to it. It's not as if that this is why I'm saying that different political regimes lead to different traditions, because people are trying to solve different problems. So I think it's a much more complex question to ask. What have the different traditions of Vipassana been about historically? How were they developed? That's a huge question. If you say, how were the traditions being taught in the West, in prisons, for example, then it becomes very much a simple didactic sort of pedagogic formula. And it's very simple. You don't have to go very far. And I think it's been quite powerful. I mean, the Ba Khin tradition has managed to formulate it in a very packaged, easy to understand way, and people don't necessarily get very confused. And almost every moment I encounter somebody who's practiced it, and they don't know anything about Burma. They don't know anything about the traditions that these derive from. That's too large a question. But they know the technique, and they've mastered it, and they find that it's useful in their lives, and that it helps them. And certainly in prison, I mean, what I've seen in terms of documentaries like the Dhamma Brothers and so forth, I'm amazed what it can achieve in people's lives. So I'm overawed by the effects of the technique. But it doesn't mean that actually the questions that you can ask about it aren't larger than that, and they encompass the polity, colonial history, the teachers' lives, all those things.
Well, I would say that I think there are some people who go and take those contemporary Goenka courses and appreciate the benefit it has in their lives without the further questioning or understanding of where it came from. But there are also many, I think, who take it, and I would amend what you said, that they I don't remember your exact words, they're not interested, or they don't know, or they don't have an understanding. I would amend that by saying there's a number of practitioners in the Goenka tradition who would say they feel very confident they know exactly what the Burmese tradition was. They can tell you conclusively what their lineage was and where it came from. And this is where the problem then does come, that it's not just a sanitized or neat version of it, but it's a mythology, a creative mythology that's packaged as a historical truth-telling. And, it's interesting you bring up the Dhamma Brothers, because the two teachers that are featured in that documentary have since left the tradition and have, and one of whom has been a regular guest on this podcast and has talked, very vocally about the creative truth-telling and fundamentalism and lack of critical thinking, among other things, that were and I think he has a bit of embarrassment actually of how he portrays himself in the Dhamma Brothers, and so I think that's where, I agree with you that there's this that you need to, that in any field you need to find a way to have a simplified storytelling that can encompass the kind of messiness. And often when that simplified storytelling breaks down, that you then have to accommodate the confusion and the reality of what that field is. But I think that the way that the Goenka lineage is constructed and is told, it combines a creative storytelling of things that are in some cases are just a series of mistruths, of things that are not correct, and then embeds them into faith in the tradition and the practice, so that when you go back to the historical documentation and the actual messiness, it leads to a dissonance and an inability to be able to take in what that accurate information is, separated from the faith of a teacher who's told you that things are a different way.
I think you're right. It's more of a religion for a lot of people who often come from a Christian background, and for them there's only one God and one truth, and there's one tradition, right? There's nothing else. So they have to fit it in. They have to squeeze it into a monotheistic perspective. So, but when you come to Burma, you have to understand that, first of all, and this is my later research, is life cycle ceremonies. In Christianity, the church governs almost your life cycle ceremony from birth to death. Puberty, marriage, or baptism, right? So there's always one father or one officiant, one ritual specialist who does all of them in the name of the church, right? Now in Buddhism, you find that monks aren't allowed to do this. They're not allowed to be part of a procreative act, so marriage is out. They're not allowed to deal with puberty as a sexual thing, so that's out, even though the Shimbu is important, but I'll get to that in a moment. Only death, right? So what we find is that Buddhism isn't actually defining the person according to life cycle ceremonies in the same way. So they have to bring in another ritual specialist called the Bevesya, and a master of Abhiseka, who is an honorary Brahmin, and who performs all the public ceremonies that monks cannot deal with. So he's kind of like, he fits in where the monk has to opt out. So that means that as a person, of course, you go to the Shimbu, and the Shimbu has, the ordination is just a tiny little event at the end of the public ceremony. The public ceremony is dominated by the Bevesya. If he's optional, so you don't even have to have a Bevesya. So, but if he's there, then he will conduct the ceremonies for the wedding and for the Shimbu, and things like spirits come to visit, and there's lots of things going on, but they have nothing to do with specifically with Buddhism, because reproduction, procreation is not a Buddhist act. It's not part of the equation, and monks are not meant to be dealing with it. So when we already discount that Buddhism isn't taking over your life as a married person, or your puberty, it's not baptizing you as being in the name of the church. You're becoming a member of a church. There's no Sunday meetings in one place by one community. So Buddhism is already disorienting the individual compared to Christianity, which is totally oriented to one community in the name of the church. Throughout life, you have a very clear station. In Buddhism, you don't have that station at all.
Yeah.
So your procreation and your puberty and so forth is just a Brahmanic ceremony, which generally is seen as counter-Buddhist. But the monks say that's all right, because it's not our task to deal with that. So already a whole part of your life is not Buddhist. Buddhist in the sense of, this is their Buddhism. Their Buddhism says they shouldn't concern themselves with it. So, but the contrast with Christianity is so enormous that in Christianity, somebody who comes to Buddhism says, okay, I want this to take care of in my entire life, from puberty to marriage to death. But that's not what it's for.
Yeah.
So they are going to turn it into a prescription for life, which Buddhism never intended to be.
I would say, though, that many that came to, and probably still come into meditation, are, even though they may come from a Judeo-Christian tradition and background and general knowledge, I get the feeling many are not necessarily coming from being a part of one organized religion to wanting the practice. It's more from, now maybe it's changing because it's so mainstream, but the early stages, they were hippies, they were alternative movement, progressive, open-minded. if there's one characteristic that I've thought of them as, and I've thought of how this movement has taken off, it's a kind of breakdown of beliefs of systems and of wanting an antidote to this feeling that all of the development and the production that's happened in Western countries, there's still something empty. And that's also one of my theories as to why we see in some meditative traditions today, certainly Goenka, but I think it's true of the greater insight traditions, a discomfort with intellectualism, an anti-intellectualism, a feeling that intellectualism is at odds with the practice itself, which you don't find so much in Burma. The maybe to some degrees, but to a large extent, the pariyati, the study, is very much supporting the practice. And I don't know too many examples of where the practice is seen as this departure from, it's really a progression rather than a departure, a rejection of this. And so I think that in a lot of the way that it's framed, and just in discussions with meditators, when you try to bring in a certain kind of critical thought, whether it's from this historical documentation of the messiness of history, or whether it's looking at Buddhist learning and scripture, there's often a very overt rejection of that, of like, oh, well, people, that's just intellectual argumentation, and people, what we're doing is in opposition to that, and really you just need to go back into practice. The practice will answer everything that you need. And so sometimes there could be these kind of closed loops where you're being, externally and internally, you're being cut off from the permission to apply to apply critical faculties, but creative faculties as well, but certainly critical faculties, to have to continue going back into the practice without this overview of what they are.
I think in the West, religion has had competition with science, and religion lost to some extent, although now it looks as if it's winning again in the Trump era. But in Burmese, the concept of religion is a more complicated question.
Right.
So the Burmese, if you say, for example, you would say there's a distinction between bodha-sadhana and bodha-batha. So bodha-sadhana is the teachings of the Buddha, right, and how it's been perpetuated. So it's the pure teachings. It's really three types: pariya, patipa, and padiveda. So it is really the scriptures, the practice, and the realization. Mm-hmm. So that's called sadhana, bodha-sadhana. But then there's another word which isn't scriptural. It doesn't exist in the Pali language specifically in that manner, and it's kind of invented by Burmese, because they use Pali for their own ends as loanwords, just like English uses Latin loanwords to make up their own words. Mm-hmm. So in Burmese, bodha-batha is really the language or the subject of Buddhism, or the Buddha. So Buddhandom, kind of like. But generally, bodha-batha is a wider term that encompasses not just the monastic order and the teachings, but also whatever is done in the name of the Buddha as cultural elements. So sadhana is the core, right? And that perpetuates over a period of time, and it's like pure and so forth. And then to be inside the sadhana means you're a monk, sadhana-win, right? Sadhana-wun, that part of the lineage of the sadhana. But bodha-batha-win just means you're a Buddhist by miopala, meaning traditional Buddhist. Yeah. So your father and mother were Buddhists, so you've adopted the culture. So you got two kinds of Buddhists, right? You got the one who is inside the tradition, ordained, part of the pariya tradition, right? And then you've got this other one, which is on the outside a little bit, bodha-batha-win, inside the language of Buddhism, which is much more about traditional sort of father-mother inherited style of religion, right? So Batha is used for religion generally, but that was only at the time of sort of Judson was writing his dictionary in the 1850s, 40s, whatever.
This is the American
The
Baptist
American
missionary.
Baptist missionary. And he had to find some kind of equivalent, and he didn't want Christianity to look worse. So he adopted Sāsana for Christianity too. But then in the end, Badha became sort of the cross-religious comparative word. So you had bodha-batha and Kriyam-batha and Hindu-batha, right? So in Buddhists will generally make a distinction between the properly ordained Buddhists and then those who are on the outside a little bit, right? So I would say that when it comes to understanding how religion works, in the Burmese context, it has a very different meaning from the way we think of it as religion in our society, I think. Then again, there's so many different ways of understanding religion. There's almost as many ways as there are people. So we cannot generalize about it. But insofar as we adopt now, a sociological definition would be the society. Religion is society. That's the sociological meaning of Durkheim, collective conscious, right? So we take out God and we say God actually is about what we all agree on as sacred, and therefore that's society. If we can agree on something that's sacred, then that must mean that we agree on something fundamentally important. So that then becomes religion. So in our terms, we have a very different idea of religion. It's much more about the collective and about sacrality and so forth and so forth. Of course, there's so many definitions of religion. You can endlessly look at them, but one could say that Buddhism, that Buddhist experiences fit a little bit outside of that. They do make that distinction between the collective, which is actually an inferior kind of religion, bodha-batha. It's kind of a bit contaminated and a bit messed up. And then that tradition that really is a historical one, that's based on the tradition of right to the time of the Buddha from his pupils by oral tradition and then written tradition, which is the truth as taught by the Buddha. So Buddha Dhamma would then be that truth that is contained in the scriptures and the Buddha Sāsana. So there is a very different concept of religion operating here. And in that sense, sometimes people say, well, Buddhism isn't a religion because it's also not concerned with governing your life from birth to death. It says there's a path, and we were not going to encourage you to have sex or to get married or to procreate. That's not the purpose of human life necessarily. The purpose is to attain Nibbana. So we'll concentrate on that bit. And when you're sad and when you are dejected, we come and offer you some help. So death is what we concentrate on, not creating living beings. So in that sense, there's a very different, contrasting sense of religion between these traditions. And I'm not sure that it doesn't matter that it doesn't have to be received like that in the Western world. I'm not saying that Buddhism couldn't be understood as a religion in the Western world. Yeah. It is. But fundamentally, there's a huge distinction between Burmese experiences of Buddhism, which is not really coherently collective in the sense that we understand it, which is life cycle governance, strictly, and being a member of one community called the church, and then this community in the name of the church, and then this actor in the name of God. We have this single life idea. There's life, one life, and then there's heaven or hell, right? There's nothing in between. Now, Burmese have these incredibly moral dilemmas about every action they take, that they might come back as some animal in another life, so they shouldn't do this. They have this continuous burden on their mind. If I'm immoral, what will the consequences be in my next 550 lives?
Right.
That is a burden that they carry every day. And it makes life quite hard. It's something that we don't have because we can just confess and we go to heaven. Right, it's quite a simple transaction. But for them, It's a continuous practice. And so in that sense, I would say that the experience of Buddhism is quite different in these different settings. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean that you can't see Buddhism as a religion in let's say, among the Dhamma brothers or whatever. But the distinction is there in the vocabulary, in the language, in the expression, in the experience. And if you want to understand meditation, you have to understand it as that concern with not governing somebody's life in the name of God through the church and the Father or whatever, or even in the name of Big Bang science, like one solution to all the problems. But it is this repetitive, nagging problem of coming back in life again and again and being subject to suffering, impermanence, and non-self. I mean, you're never any enduring entity at any time if you look at it, because you're always becoming something else, another being, and that being is created by your actions. So if your actions are negative, you're going to be a negative being. So that experience means also that you cannot govern your life as a single life and then live forever in heaven with God. You're going to continuously be coming back with the consequences of what you did in the past. So I would say that religion is a very different phenomenon.
And so much of what you're pointing to here is language uses in English and in Burmese, and there's different dimensions I want to go here with it. I mean, one is that you're looking at the formulation of the Burmese and English words of just of how Buddhism, with large quotations around that, is being framed in early stages, and by Judson, and then we could follow through with Ledi Sayadaw, and then I would fast forward to a far degree in terms of what Goenka was doing in English, of really going out of his way to claim that he wasn't teaching Buddhist meditation, and it was non-sectarian, even while simultaneously making an extremely sectarian kind of mindset and organization.
Well, I mean, it's true that it's not necessarily purely ordained versus non-ordained. Ordained retains the historical lineage, uncontaminated. The practice tradition gets interrupted and could be contaminated at any point. It's a bit like you're culturing kefir or yogurt, and you use a dirty spoon every time you eat from it, and then you use that as a culture. You end up with a mess. So what you have to do is you have to keep pure the original culture, so that you can always restore the good culture. Otherwise, you're eating contaminated food. Well, the same thing is with the Sāsana, obviously. It's that through the cultural elements, the bodha-batha elements, you lose the historical continuity of the purity of the teachings, because people just make of it what they want, right? So in that sense, you have to see this as a scriptural learning tradition with ordination, where the teaching remains intact and doesn't get changed. But then what happens in the practice side can change depending on the new order that you live in, the new historical moment, and you make it relevant in new ways. So the Mahasi did that. He made Vipassana relevant in new ways. But so did many other teachers of Vipassana during the Burmese history. But they will always have emphasized going back to the original culture, which they had, and they didn't want to contaminate it. So they're not saying, my history is Buddha's history. They're saying, I went back to the original teachings. I looked at it and found that this was an acceptable way of teaching. Right. And this has been confirmed by the lineage. So what I'm teaching is correct, and others will testify that it's correct. Without that admission, your teaching will be contaminated, potentially, because you're just creating what you want out of it.
It sounds like just a bit of a dressing if one wants to be a bit cynical.
Well, maybe, but on the other hand, I remember there was once a foreigner who'd practiced Mahasi, and he said that he was already Sotapanna in the open, as he had only meditated, I think, for a short while, and it's what you call inflation of achievement. So a lot of foreigners, they think, wow, why don't I just take a little bit of Yahanda-ness from this tradition, and I can be a Yahanda too. And they start claiming this, right? So that this is very problematic for Burmese, because they have rules about how you can claim. I mean, generally they're very shy of claiming to be Sotapanna or Ariya, right? Because it's against the rules. You don't do that, because it creates division, right? And we started off with that, didn't we? In our conversation. The idea that some claim certain kinds of sacredness in the tradition. But foreigners tend to do that because they have no concept. They think that this is... so they don't even... They think, okay, so I can't get Nibbana straight away in my life. Okay, so why don't I just claim to be a Sotapanna or Sagaraga or a Yahanda even is better. Let me claim to be a Yahanda. Then you get this inflation of achievement. So you have to go back to the rule book. And the rule book says, don't ever claim to be an Ariya. Because nobody who achieved it should be claiming that. That's the point. Because then you get following and you get all sorts of... you're already teaching wrongly by claiming that. So you must go back to it. You can't just short-circuit it. Yes, it's true that some of the meditators use... so in Burmese you would have a special language for monks. And some have adapted this to lay meditators. So for example, if you offer food to monks, you say Sun Chue. And you can also do that for meditators. You can Sun Chue.
So that was a development.
Or you can say they instead of saying Tamesare, they eat, they say Pompeide. So for the monastic order you have a vocabulary that's specific to the monastery, to the monks. They don't sleep, but they chain. Me'ebu. Hunji me'ebu. Chain. So they curl up and rest or something like that. So some of that vocabulary got adopted by meditators as well. Because the idea is that they are meditating, and in that sense they're implementing the instructions of the Buddha, and they are keeping the precepts, so they are morally high. They are doing all the good things, and they're implementing the Sāsana. So in that sense, they're regarded as maybe Paramattha Bhikkhu or something like that, like monks of the ultimate truth. So that's kind of acceptable discourse among meditators. So so in that sense, we could say that there's an equivalence.
And so then how does that language, that difference in language in, I don't know what years we're looking at, 70s, 80s, 90s, where it starts to develop among your field research, how does that change in language in terms of how, because again, this is going back to like whatever variations we're using a Buddhist or inside the Sāsana. So how does that language use and change start to impact and affect the way that one thinks about oneself in this spiritual, religious tradition, whatever we want to call it?
So this idea of sadhana, it's that can be adopted to even lay practitioners. Sometimes I mean, sadhana has this duplicity. It's inside the sadhana wing. Win there means to be inside.
Inside the Sāsana.
To enter. But wunda, sadhana wunda can be abbreviated as sadhana wing. Wunda means lineage. Vamsa.
Wow.
So that you have this duplicity there. So you can be in the lineage, enter the lineage, or it can be the lineage. So you have that kind of a duplicity there. But it's not as if categorically you would place a meditator inside the Sāsana. But there is a discourse, like a shadow discourse, that this is reasonably appropriate. And even if you look at, let's say, Shan traditions, some of the Shan monks, when they unordained, they still keep their monastic name, even though they're a layperson. So there's, for example, a meditation teacher who is known by a monastic name, but when he's actually a layperson at that time, because so there are many different traditions of Buddhism too, and this is not always recognized, that Shan Buddhism has its own traditions, and that the continuity between monkhood and laity is there a little bit greater. Even after you leave the monkhood, you retain some of those monastic elements, like name, and that's not the case for the Burma so much.
So can this language use and change that happened at this time, which historically was never the case, as I understand, there wasn't precedent for this, can this be seen as an empowerment of lay agency within Buddhist practice?
Potentially, yes, but I think it's been exaggerated by people who look at it from the outside. And I mean, we're talking here about, let's say, there was this whole time that I think about Sri Lanka, there was this idea that the middle class had redefined Buddhism as a lay religion, and so forth and so forth. And I think that's never got that far. The monk is still seen as ultimately the one who can live best to perpetuate the Buddha's teachings, because a layperson doesn't have the time, doesn't have the inclination, has family, has all these other commitments, hasn't renounced. So they cannot really, truly spend all their time learning and studying and practicing. So in that sense, the layperson is disadvantaged vis-a-vis the monk. They have to make a living. Where do they get their food from? Who is offering? If you're a monk, you're offered food. So, okay, you give your blessings, but you can continue your practice, right? So you don't have to earn money, right? You don't have to earn a livelihood. So I think in most cases, still, I don't think ever the monk has been edged from their position of the supreme continuer, and a nun, because nuns have great respect as well. Of course, in Thailand, there's the bhikkhuni tradition now, but in Burma that hasn't been admitted fully. But this idea of continuing the Buddhist teaching through practice, that is really important, and a lay person will have lots of distractions in their lay life, and if they're really serious, they will become a monk or a nun, right? Why would they not? It would simplify their lives. They don't have to worry about clothing. They don't have to worry about their food. They can just do their studies and their practice, right? So a layperson is not the best equipped to do that. So I think that is very much like an outsider's view, which we've had in Protestant religion. So Protestant Buddhism, right? The idea is that you can have a layperson suddenly being the teacher in the church.
Well, they call it Protestant Buddhism.
Protestant Buddhism. Yeah, there you are.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that has been largely from the Sri Lanka side, because that's where they had maybe a longer colonial influence and maybe slightly less defiant Buddhist traditions in terms of practice than they had in the Burmese case.
But the spread of Buddhism or Buddhist ideas to the West has often, the term in the field has been modern Buddhism or Protestant Buddhism to infer just this.
And I think that it's a little bit of a misnomer. I think because the idea again is that you can laicize all forms of Buddhism. And I don't think you can in the Burmese case. Thai case may be different. I mean, now maybe a lot of people are upset about corrupt monks and so forth. And there's conversation about, what is this Buddhism about? Maybe lay Buddhism is better sometimes.
But if you can't bring laity into every form of Burmese Buddhism, then where does Ba Khin fit into that? What is the meaning of him and what he did?
Well, he was an accountant general.
Yeah.
And it was about reform of government. And I think it was very much like Unu also saw or wanted. He thought that if everybody meditated, there would be no need for a police or an army.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Because the army itself, when they lose power or they give up power, they then meditate. Yeah. So there's this continuous flipping.
Yeah.
So lay Buddhism is the greater examples of lay Buddhism are the Vipassana lay teachers, and there were a few, but they never quite gained the influence. Ba Khin gained most influence outside the country. not inside. Not many Burmese necessarily practice the Ba Khin tradition. It's very much foreigners.
True, yeah.
So I think, again, you come back to this issue.
Yeah.
Is who are the inheritors of the Sāsana? And then the idea is that if monks are serious, if you're serious about learning Buddhism, you try to become a nun or a monk. And you devote your time to study and practice. And that's still the main model for the practice of Buddhism. And it's not to become a lay person. Your influence is limited. You cannot influence the same number of people according to these criteria.
Sure, nor can you develop yourself to that same degree by that belief.
But we believe that in Protestantism was very influential, and capitalism went with Protestantism, and that lay people were very much more influential there because they could then become fathers and teachers, and God is in your heart. It's not out there in the church. It's not mediated. It's direct.
Exactly. Right.
So all those kind of. So we kind of said, okay. So in Buddhism, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Not quite. I don't think so.
But that was part of the Ledi Sayadaw revolution, we can say, or the seeds he planted, and that's where I want to go back to the terminology there, because you described how bodha-batha, which is normally the word-to-word translation that we often hear of Buddhism, you call it Buddhism after Christendom, and often bodha-batha is how today in contemporary times we just say, Buddhism, bodha-batha, but you described going back to the 19th century American Baptist missionary Judson, how that was a word that he came up with as a way to somewhat diminish the standing of the Buddhist teachings. Now, fast forward and getting into Ledi Sayadaw, who was, just as Judson was an outsider engaging inward towards the Burmese Buddhist experience, Ledi Sayadaw was a Burmese Buddhist monk who was certainly making huge waves and inroads within the country, but was also engaging outwards and was having discussions and bringing Buddhist thoughts and theories and bringing in science and the latest developments in science and technology. And so if we then look at this terminology that came about during the time of Judson, how did Ledi Sayadaw then pick it up? What words was he using, and what were his meanings with those choices of words that he was employing?
That's quite a difficult question. You'd have to analyze how his register differed from prior monks. That's a thesis to be written.
Okay. Yeah.
I think Brown did some work on Ledi Sayadaw. I'm not sure how he concluded that, or if he addressed it, but that would be an interesting question. Yeah, we need more historical work to see how vocabulary changed, how expressions changed over time. I'm
wondering if he used bodha-batha, and if so, how the connotation by that point had changed, and how his imprint on it might have also changed it.
I mean, you don't use bodha-batha in any of the doctrinal treatises because you have no occasion to. So you just continue to talk about Sāsana, this and that and that and that. It's only when you're engaged as an anthropologist or as a lay person about distinguishing monks from non-monks. But generally, this is not what monks are concerned with. They're not concerned with the lay world specifically as a lay person. They just try to encourage them to practice good practice. So they don't necessarily characterize the entire. I mean, there's no reason to talk about Buddhism unless you're opposing it to another tradition, like Christianity.
Which Ledi was doing.
Yeah, he was doing. Yeah. I don't know. I would have to look at it. See. Yeah. There's quite a lot of work to be done, I would say.
Sure. And then going back to your reference of Aung San Suu Kyi earlier, I wanted to follow up with contrasting a comment you made with Ne Win, how you were contrasting what the discourse around how Ne Win was describing his Buddhist practice and Vipassana coming from Ledi Sayadaw and what he was actually doing. And I've also often been curious with Aung San Suu Kyi. I think there's quite a discourse out there in terms of how she's framed and presented Buddhist practice and her teachers. but I've often been curious about her actual practice, and I wonder what you have been able to learn about beyond the discourse, what her actual engagement in meditation or practice has been.
Well, as I understand it, she worked very much through U Pandita, who was the teacher of women in the Mahasi tradition, in the Mahasi Weikza, the main center in Yangon. She took advice from him as well on many issues. This is typical, which is that Unu had the Mahasi, and he also asked advice in many ways. So every politician needs a guru. And so Aung San Suu Kyi also needed somebody unless you're a dictator like Ne Win, he didn't have an obvious Buddhist teacher, but those who came after him did try to cultivate different kinds of Vipassana teachers, or famous monks or charismatic monks. So it's almost as if you want to be a politician to be reckoned with, you will need a monk who is outside of the realm of criticism, right? It should be a very pure person, right? Not subject to controversy necessarily. So I don't know what she's said to be practicing it, but I have no idea whether how she does it or in what kind of detail. I think we'll probably find evidence of it when she writes her account, if she ever has an opportunity to write it, because she's still under house arrest, even in jail at the moment. So I think she spent more than half of her life behind bars almost, which is quite a thing in the life of somebody who cares for their country, I think. It's a very difficult issue. I'm conflicted for various reasons. One is that one shouldn't overdo the Buddhist discourse about Myanmar or Burma. There are so many different religions, so many different peoples, so many different languages. Yeah. And I think one of the biggest risks is to dominate the entire conversation about the country in terms of Buddhist discourse. I think that is a very problematic way of dealing with diversity. And I think if at any time we pay attention to diversity, it should be right now, because without transcending that diversity in a positive manner, we cannot move on from here. So my view is that my own research on Buddhism, I have an experience, but I feel that I need more experience in the diverse kind in order to compensate for otherwise overdoing the uniformity of thinking. And in that sense, when I'm here in Thailand, in Chiang Mai, for example, I encounter so many different traditions, and they're not Buddhist, and they're equally interesting, and they're also just as worthy. And so I think that to talk about the country in terms of one discourse is like taking away from a lot of people who are aspiring for freedom their opportunity to express themselves. So in that sense, I'm rowing back, and I'm here much more concerned with the diversity of that experience than I used to be. And in that sense, I feel the problem in the country is that, first of all, there is a lack of discussion and interest in history. Proper history, not just nationalist history. And in that sense, I think that their minorities have been discounted simply because there's only one form of history, and all the others are ignored. In other countries where democracy has been present for a long time, we come to terms with diversity, and we say, okay, so there are many different types of people who lived in this country. How interesting. They also have a history that's quite different. how refreshing. The Welsh, the Scots, right? We don't discount them, the Irish.
Yeah.
We actually should be looking at their history, and over time we discuss it and we become familiar with it. In Burma, there has been no episode where they've had the opportunity to peacefully come to terms with diversity. It's always been on the precipice of some kind of warfare of one kind or another. If only because of colonial heritage, the British brought in foreign labor, then all that foreign labor is suddenly deemed to be foreign, including people who have been there for centuries. That means that you get a disconnect, and you cannot come to terms with diversity on peaceful terms. And I think that this is the tragedy of the country, is that this diversity has never been fully recognized and accepted and discussed and internalized. And that means that a lot of people continue to say, these people are not from my country. And then, of course, you can say, okay, it's true that border agents are motivated by money and there's a lot of corruption. You can buy off anybody. Look at Mandalay. It's second Hong Kong or second China, right? People buy permits to come in and no problem. And then every border that happens. So if you don't trust your own border guards, already you realize that hundreds of thousands can come in without any limit, and potentially that can create problems, because you'd accept some kind of balance in any country, that it's not going to be taken over by other interests. So then you get this paranoia. But now we have that fear in the West. If you look at America, how it's now simply arresting people. I have a Burmese student who has got a visa. He's got the scholarship to go to an American university, do his PhD. He's had to say no. He's got the stamp in his passport. I'm not going because I will be arrested potentially as a foreigner.
And sent to Sudan or
sent to Sudan.
Yeah.
So, okay, we can blame the Burmese for having that total misunderstanding about their own people. But it's now happening all over the world. And the question is, do we have a moral ground, a high moral ground to stand on? I don't think at the moment we have. And I think we should be more considerate in looking at history and saying that many Burmese act out of not knowing their history. The worst thing is when you act knowing your history and you do it. And that's what's happening in Europe and in America. So I think actually we are a little bit worse than they are in some respects.
Yeah.
Because the ignorance was there largely because there's never been study or education or information, and colonialism has obviously disrupted a lot of things. So in that sense, I would say that we now come out actually worse ourselves than they do in terms of historical events. It's always easy to judge somebody wrong on the minutest of breaking of rules that we have. But it's much more difficult to see that people act on the wrong information and make the wrong decisions. So yeah, that's where I feel that we now have to row back and not see Myanmar as necessarily solely a Buddhist country, but as a very diverse country with very diverse people who all have their aspirations.
So then, taking this broader view and appreciating this diverse history and these many threads that are happening, I guess a question I'd pose to you here, and also to whet the appetite of some of your recent interest in looking at some of these diverse traditions, as you whet the appetite to such an extent to purely looking at Buddhist and Pati lineages. The question that stands out to me here is in looking at the development of these different Pati lineages that were then influenced by their political regimes, to bring in your point, I think there was one small thread we could say that you already discussed, where you were looking at the influence of U Nu and sending Buddhist missionaries out to the Zomi Hills. That's one example of where the ethnics and the minorities start to come into the story. But let's bring them into a broader view, because as we're talking about these political actors, and we're also talking about the rise of the Mahasis and Mahasi Sayadaw and Mahasi tradition and lineage, and Ba Khin and Goenka and U Pandita, Pa Ok, on and on, simultaneous to the development of these figures and teachings and lineages and the political associations, you do have the experience and the existence of entire ethnic communities and regions and minorities, and also those individual minorities and pockets of those minorities that are in the urban Bamar areas as this is taking off and as this is going on. And so have you found some interesting convergences of what was happening parallel or converging on this time and as these traditions were taking off? Or alternatively, do you have questions that you're trying to explore to get answers to regarding these parallel tracks and experiences that coincide or are influenced by or influenced the development of these traditions?
That's a really difficult question you're asking. Maybe I can compare how within Buddhism they regarded me initially. So, for example, I was a monk for 9 days. The idea is to be a man in Buddhist society, you have to have been a monk for a while at least. So I became a monk for 9 days, and when I was sitting there, I was an ordained monk. Some villagers and people would visit me, and they would ask me, "Are you a Christian?" It was perfectly fine that I could be a Christian and a monk at the same time. That didn't represent any conflict to them in their ideas. So I would first like to say that there is an element of tolerance in everyday Buddhism that I do not think exists fully in the Christian church, where there is an element of control over a whole life. So I would try to explain, yes, I'm not a Christian. I come from a country that's mostly Christian, and my parents were nominally Christian, mio pala. But I'm here to study Buddhism, and so that's why I became ordained, just to know what it's like. And that was all fine, it's no problem. So generally I would say that Buddhists generally do not really want to govern somebody else's life. They're not out for converting somebody into Buddhism. There's no point to it. But if you look at the history of Christianity, you see that all the witches were burned, right? They don't exist anymore. Spirit cults, no spirits can be challenging the power of God. There should be no power outside of God. So scientists are also out. Anything that questions the power of God should really be eliminated from consideration. And people shouldn't listen to these. Okay, they've lost the battle because, science progressed and the church had to accept that science was part of life. And in the Catholic Church, you had Jesuits who did practice science, and all those things were eventually to some extent tolerated. But there is a real question there. Are you really doing the right thing by questioning the power of God as having created mankind and everything? That issue doesn't exist in Buddhism at all. They're not saying that Buddha created anything. The Buddha didn't create anybody, right? Buddha just discovered what the laws of the universe were. So they are saying whatever lay people are doing, that's their concern. Monks will not say you cannot worship a ghost or a spirit. There are spirit cults in Burma that are highly lively, and they are meeting every year, and they have whole land dedicated to them, little temples here and there. It's fine. All these supernatural entities are spread all over the country, and they are all accepted. And the monks would just say, well, they just they just worldly matters, secular matters. It doesn't concern us. Just like your marriage doesn't concern us. Your puberty doesn't really concern us. Your sexuality is not of concern, right? That's a worldly matter. Leave that behind. So they're not trying to rule or overtake or prescribe how you should live your life. In that sense, they're not forbidding anything of that kind. It's what you decide to do. Mm-hmm. So the same thing for other religions. You do not see generally ordinary Buddhists saying these religions should be forbidden or shouldn't be existing or whatever. It's not competing. It's not competing for the same territory. So they're fine with it. So where it goes wrong is when you have the military using Buddhism as a nationalist movement to edge out foreigners, to edge out impure elements. Then you get a weaponization of Buddhism, which is a very different kind of Buddhism. So, for example, pulling down the churches in ethnic minority areas, pulling down the crosses, destroying their places of worship. That is very much a different concern here. Here we are dealing with naked power by an army that really wants to dominate every possible expression of resistance. But they even see young people as being resistance. Mm-hmm. They see everybody as resistant. There's nothing. You can wear the color of white on a day in protest. Just wearing white is already your resistance. Right. You're already guilty. Yeah. You should be in prison. Yeah. So everybody should be in prison, irrespective of who you are. But they will be particularly vicious against those who are against their tradition, what they consider their tradition, which is Buddhist. And then it becomes weaponized. But you see, civilians generally do not have that. So in a sense, whenever there's a little bit of uncertainty, then you get this Dhammadhara idea, Dhammadhara, the threat to the Dhamma. Yeah. And then you get sort of, boy from another religion rapes girl from Buddhist religion, and we all need to set this right, so let's riot, let's lynch these other religions. So you get that sort of format. As soon as there's an election or something like that, or there's anything in doubt, then you get this. But it's very much like an introduced discord, which is then played upon and make it worse in order to win some kind of battle over the minds of people.
Or the Islamophobia.
Yes, and if you think about it, of course it is quite, as a Buddhist, if you do not govern your own children's lives through rites of passage, then you can imagine how fearful they are when other religions come in that do. So in that sense, one can see that if ever there is a question about heritage, for example, if a monotheistic religion marries somebody from Buddhism, then the monotheistic religion has all the ritual obligations to the children, that the children must follow it. That means that tradition wins in a union. So the children becomes that religion because they have the prescriptions. Buddhism doesn't have any prescription of that kind.
So much the baptism or the conversion.
Yeah, they don't have
the
it.
Same way. But you don't see like the modern forms that like Shimpyu novitiation has taken place, or some of the other Buddhist ceremonies or rituals, that it's not kind of organically rising to that level.
No, it's not prescribed in the same way. So it's more like you make marriage for your mother, etc. So it's bound up, but it's not going to be your savior. that you do it for your mother, but you don't do it for yourself necessarily. It's the idea is that
It's not a rite of passage.
no, so it doesn't bring you to heaven or anything like that. It doesn't. It is a rite of passage, but if you look at the actual ceremony, 3 days in the village, only 1 hour is ordination at the very end, and that's a sangha matter. All the rest is just celebration, and is all engaging spirits, engaging all sorts of forces in society and so forth. And it's not really a Buddhist ritual, it's much more Brahmanic, and it's recognized as such, it's described as such. Like you get a Brahmanical cord, you get put on a child, right? It's a symbolic Brahmanical cord.
That's
It's
ironic.
not a Buddhist, not a Buddhist ceremony.
That's a bit ironic for a growing xenophobia.
There you are.
Yeah.
There you are. So in that sense, I think Buddhism tolerates greater diversity in everyday matters, because God is not all-powerful. There's no God that's all-powerful. So all kinds of traditions are acceptable because they're just ways of living. These are secular differences.
And yet there seems, just anecdotally speaking, I have found and this is something that really shocked me when I came from the self-described non-sectarian Goenka tradition to Burma. I was shocked then, I'm not now, by how few non-Buddhists, ethnic Burmese non-Buddhists, I found attending a Goenka retreat or a Mahasi retreat, or someone, and as I would speak to friends that were ethnic minorities and religious minorities and talk about, my enthusiasm for meditation, I would sometimes describe these scientific mind-body relations, just the mere, universal experience of observing the breath. And in my naive early days, I couldn't understand how, say, like a Chin Christian who was interested in health benefits and greater inner wisdom and understanding, that when I would mention that just the fact of observing the breath going in and out of the nose, that this was a way to develop kind of calm and peace and greater insights, that there was a resistance to even taking something like this on, because it brought on this whole Burmanization and oppression that they had experienced. And, again, in my naiveness at that time, I just could not understand how a simple breathing observation could be equated with something political and repressive. But, there you go. And that's also the reason why I think, at least anecdotally, I wouldn't be surprised that the numbers bore this out, that even as there could be an incredible tolerance for a Christian such as yourself simultaneously being a monk, there's somehow a real scarcity of non-Buddhists in Myanmar who come to attend any kind of meditation retreat for those political overtones.
That's interesting. Experiences from, let's say, Kachin, if they come in as a Kachin into, let's say, Mandalay University or whatever, they do feel that, for example, if they had let's say, they might have a Burmese Buddhist girlfriend or whatever, that the parents regard them as a little bit savage, a little bit outside, right? A little bit not quite the right kind of tradition that you would choose a husband from.
Yeah.
And that anxiety is there, right? So that there is this division at the level of perception. But at the same time, almost every Burman is a mixture of different minorities, and they just happen to dress Burman, and they don't remember their Karen language or whatever, and they've gone through the educational system, and they've been integrated, so they become Burman. They may not be even Buddhist, but they become Burman, kind of like. But if you think about it, okay, let's introduce the idea of Zomia, right? So Willem van Schendel invented this idea of Zomia, and he said, we've looked at history all wrong. Actually, what we've done is we thought of Southeast Asia as being all about the mandala systems, the centralized rice-growing areas with great influence. But actually, what you should be looking at historically is the areas that are outside that, the mountainous areas where all these other developments are happening, which have been completely ignored historically. Well, if you think about the languages spoken, let's say I went to an event to do some teaching in India or with some CDM practitioners. They were all Chin, and there were 6 of them, and I asked them, so what is civil disobedience in your language? And they said, I'm sorry, we don't know. We speak 6 different languages, and we don't have one way of expressing it. And anyway, in our language, you don't talk about civil disobedience because there's no word for it. So we couldn't discuss the intricacies of the language because they were all. Now, so what unites them often is the church. The church brings a unity that is unprecedented to them. And so they have a common development in the sense that much of their traditions they've discarded because Christianity isn't very favorable towards retaining all these supernatural ideas of entities that might be rivaling the Christian ideas of power. The power must only come from one source, and all these others are interfering with this, so they have to be eliminated. So they're gone. So they have a history that is kind of more like mediated through the church, but doesn't fully tie to their historical roots. And so then some minorities also end up thinking that they are, through the Bible, that they are actually long lost Israelites, Jewish people, who should be going back to their country.
Israel.
Yes. And there are groups from various tribes in India and so forth that have actually made their way back. I mean, historically, of course.
I met years ago in Yangon, I met a Jewish individual who was setting out from Yangon to trek through the remote Chin Hills with his belief on whatever historical background or work he had done, that one of the lost tribes of Israel resided somewhere remotely in the Chin Hills, and he wanted to find them and bring them back to Israel.
Yeah, so there's this literature, right? And so it's appealing for one can say that their sense of history has reoriented itself towards Israel as the center for Christianity, right? So that takes it away from the locality to some extent. So then there's this need to kind of reinvent what it is to be a Chin or Kachin, and then because they have no necessarily written records, it's quite difficult for them to actually have a full recollection, given also the different languages everywhere. How do you bring back a sense of history across generations? This is where we've got the pariyati, right? We talked about pariyati. Pariyati gives you that sense of complete secure inheritance of history, of a teaching. Well, but in Zomia, people didn't have that tradition, so they could see that others had it, but their culture is mostly oral, so they develop as they go, and they don't necessarily have a record of everything that happens, right? So Christianity introduces writing, it introduces a very clear sense of history, and suddenly they're part of this larger group, and they also have connections with the outside world through the church, which is very helpful, right? So it has many benefits. But if you think about how they might regard Buddhism, Buddhism doesn't become any friendlier because you're dealing with a monotheist religion that isn't necessarily that tolerant of other religions, whether it's Islam or Buddhism.
Right.
So in that sense, it doesn't encourage a reaching out necessarily, and that's So these are divisions that are not very easy to bridge.
And this is where the nuance then brings us to another layer of complexity. I'm thinking of an interview I recently did with the Kachin artist, documentarian Zach Tunen, who is actually based in Amsterdam, and where your native country of Holland, and he has been on a journey to reclaim the pre-Christian Kachin identity, and feels that the Christian conversion and imposed culture, in his words, that has come over the Kachin people, that it has erased their traditional connection to their ancestors, to their animism, to their medicine, to their music, to their culture, to their people. has described how the coup has been this really tragic interruption of his work in trying to meet the last remaining elders who have pieces of this knowledge that he's trying to restore and that he's been unable to with the danger of the coup. But we're then we're making another mistake if we start if we leave out this pre-Christian background of these people and present them as purely Christian minorities with this Burmanization and Buddhist and Buddhist dominance, because we're then not looking at how recently, relatively, their conversion was and what their practice was before that. So this then does get even more complex as we're then simultaneously tracing the rise of these, say the great work of Ledi Sayadaw, or the development of these practice lineages, and where this simultaneous history was also developing and intersecting.
Yes, because if you think about it, that continuously you've got the 37 nat, right? National nats. Mm. And every household has a spirit, household spirit. Mimagiri, only, let's say, a coconut in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And every person also has a misang pasang nat. They have a father-mother side nat, right? So spirits are everywhere. Mm. In everyday Burmese Buddhist life. Mm-hmm. And they're all fine. But they're all been eliminated in the sort of Christian traditions, monotheistic traditions. So that sets up a division which is probably that Buddhism looks more like a form of contamination to a Christian church. Mm. And Judson tried to convert Buddhists for so long that in the end he had to go to the hills to find people willing enough to take Christianity seriously. But no Buddhists would even accept what he was saying about there being one God and so forth. He had real difficulties bringing that message. Yeah. So so the reality then is that there's perhaps there's so much tolerance really for these different supernatural elements that it's just seen as a fact of life among Buddhists. So, but that has disappeared with a lot of the those who converted to Christianity.
Mm. And then you describe how the current military and the nationalist Buddhism, they're promoting that they see contestation everywhere. They see everywhere as a battle for supremacy, and that's why they're destroying crosses. It's why they're doing forced conversions. It's why there's this rampant fear of Islamophobia and the Muslims taking over. And so I just want to take a moment to contrast that with prior Bamar Buddhist authorities of going back to different kingdoms. And from my reading of Burmese history, it seems that some of those early Burmese kingdoms, or really any Burmese kingdom, they were, what strikes me reading is just how incredibly diverse and multicultural there were, not just in terms of who they allowed to live with some degree of freedom in some periphery of the kingdom, but also in their advisors on the court and the influence of different religions and different outsiders in this current xenophobia incarnation, that how many outsiders were coming from other traditions to influence the highest levels. And so do you see any precedent of this this current xenophobic trying to contest every quarter of this desperate feeling of Buddhist survival and dominance? Do you see precedent with that with former Buddhist authorities?
Do you know William Carey? William Carey was preceded Judson. And he went up to the king in Mandalay, and he joined him and was trying to ingratiate himself. And what happened is that the king then thought, oh, okay, so what I can do is I can use him as an ambassador in the colonial UK, right? So he went to India to become the Burmese ambassador, and he arrived he was a missionary. but he had been turned into an ambassador for the king. And he arrived in his longi at the British rule in India, and he arrived there saying, "I'm the new Burmese ambassador." And they were incredulous because they couldn't believe that a Christian missionary could be sent by. So he was the son of a Carey who was sent by the Baptist Church to India, and his father was a doctor but also learned Sanskrit in India, and he was the son born in India who then went to Burma to missionize and bring the light to the Burmese. So then they sent him packing, because they sent him packing on a boat, and he had lots of things with him. What did he have? They had some magic things. He had some printing machines on his boat and so forth. And then they went all the way up the Irrawaddy, and then the boat sank, apparently. And I don't know what happened afterwards. But in any case, this idea of the Burmese king using a foreign religion, a foreigner, a missionary who came to give him the light of Christianity, sent him back to the colonial powers to become an ambassador. Nobody believed it, but this is just quite interesting. Is that indeed there is an element of identity is not specifically religious identity here, and maybe identity during the time of the king was maybe something totally different. There were lots of foreigners, as you said. There were Brahmins and so forth at the court, and they had different quarters, different foreigners, and they all played a different role for the king, kind of like. But the idea of the king as governing diversity was probably correct. That it wasn't trying to harmonize and sort of turn into one single system, like nowadays often regimes will want to do. Much more nationalist, right? In those days you didn't have nationalism in that sense. So how do Buddhist officials deal with minorities? It's a good question. Something that needs a bit of thought.
Sure. Well, the story you just told reminds of the Christian missionary being then converted for other purposes. It reminds me somewhat of all of these Christian missionary schools that predominated over so much education before 1962, and how much you hear about Burmese Buddhists going to those schools, getting an education, learning English, learning skills, and then and not picking up the Christian part of it at all, but then using that to go and advance something else. And most famously, Sayadaw Ba Khin. Sayadaw Ba Khin came from an extremely poor background. Based on his incredible aptitude, won a scholarship to go to one of the top schools, St. John's. And then it was through St. John's that he learned two things. He learned English, which allowed him to start the International Meditation Center, which was a part of was that launch of being able to bring meditation overseas and the start of the mindfulness movement. But then also was able to learn certain technical skills that landed him to be in the Accountant General's office, which also was part and parcel how IMC started. I mean, if he just happened to be some guy who happened to learn English, he couldn't have done what he did. So it was his Christian missionary education, which then launched the worldwide meditation movement.
Yeah, you may be right that he learned a lesson from the Christians on how to missionize.
Maybe that too.
Maybe true. Yeah. So the Burmese concept of Thadana Buddha is missionize, but it's a very different concept from missionize in the Christian sense. Thadana Buddha is much more about establishing usually a monastic presence, because monks are very important in the sense that they teach a more pure form of Buddhism, and that this in itself pacifies the environment. So you often see that villages need a monastery to keep order in the environment, and that the beginning of establishing order is sending a monk to a place. then that follows, settlement follows, kind of in the wake of that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Kind of puts order and brings order to a place.
It sounds like you're describing it as a colonizing aspect.
I think probably it is. Yes. Probably if you ask about the history of how Buddhism spread, there's sometimes an intentionality behind it, which is through political leaderships who want to change the environment into a Buddhist environment. But sometimes it's just ordinary lay people who believe that merit making is important for everyone, and who don't necessarily see it as Buddhicizing things, but just as creating the opportunity for generating harmony through making merit. And here we have to come to this idea that if the way I interpret, let's say, the Buddhist family, I see it more as the product of merit making than biology, in terms of the ideal, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that when you make merit together with somebody, you come back together in a future life, in a positive context. So your rebirth then is together. So a family is not primarily a biological act, like having children and then being together, but it's primarily a meritorious act from the past, coming into realization, to fruition in the present. So the family is a product of merit making. Merit making itself is an engine for future positive, harmonious relationships. And so making merit is a good thing for everyone, irrespective of who you are, and that will have good effects on your future lives. So in that sense, merit making is the Shimbyu, the novitiation ceremony, is one of the most important merit making events. And it's not to govern the life, but it's to create an opportunity to make merit for the community as a whole, and then to be together again in the future on positive terms, harmonious terms. So in that sense, biology, which in our mind comes first, comes last. It's just the act of merit making is what creates the relationships that endure and that come back. So in that sense, I would say that establishing the monastery is not necessarily an act of taking over a community that is there already, but it's more about creating the opportunity for what they believe will help people improve their spiritual lives and have a better rebirth.
Well, this is where I look at like a place like this. What we've just seen is the development in the last half century of, say, the Sagaing Hills, which I my guess is that if you were to research some other developments throughout Burmese history, you might find something similar, where, you know, the Sagaing Hills outside Mandalay have always been this place where ascetics and those wanting to dedicate themselves to a very arduous practice would go, and they would go to escape from the civilization. But then, in large part, the civilization would want to find them, because you can make such great merit, you know, if you give to a dog or a beggar or a non-Buddhist or a monk or a very highly developed monk, the level of merit you get is going to be different for all of these. And so if you're able to find that hard practicing, you know, high achieving monk deep in the forest, and you're able to give rice to him, then your level of merit is going to be so much more extreme.
That is true for the object of merit, but it's also who you make merit with. So if you make merit together with somebody, that relationship perpetuates into the future on harmonious terms. So it's, of course, you're right, it's the object of merit, but it's also the togetherness of making it.
But that's more proving the point I'm trying to make, which is that then it's not only you going to find that high object, but your family, your community, or in the case of Sagaing Hills, sometimes, you know, royal caravans that were coming out there. When I stayed in the Sagaing Hills a long time, and I became fascinated with the stone walkways that were built into them, and seeing how old they were, in the sense that the middle of the walkways were always worn down. And so when I started asking my Sayadaw, who I was spending time with, about that, he would describe, well, these were, you know, royal caravans that would come across the water, and they built these for them to then traverse across. And so then I started to think, well, that's interesting, because this 19th century monk and this 18th century monk and this early 20th century monk with these, that we hear such amazing background about their meditation achievements, who came to the Sagaing Hills to get away from that civilization, then that civilization caught up with them in order for that merit making. But then even as this started to develop and there were, it became less just dense, crazy forest and jungle, and there were pathways in there. They were still just pathways, and it was actually very difficult, even just a generation ago, to have to walk up these steep hills until Siddhu Sayadaw came and did two really important things. I think it was in the 1990s or so, where he developed water systems, where before you were only able to have enough water either in terms of how far you were from the water or how much you collected during rainy season. And he built, not a lot of paved roads, but he built at least one paved road that was able to go at least up the hill. And, the Sayadaw I was with, who knew the history, would describe how his Sayadaw had scars from a tiger attack in the Sagaing Hills not long ago, that it was so dense before Siddhu went and further developed it with an idea of merit making and helping lay people to more easily get access to it. And he then, when I was so amazed that this, just recently there was a tiger attack on a monk, he then walked me to a nearby monastery that I'd always noticed as the architecture being extremely strange and unlike anything I'd ever seen, and was always curious about it. And he went and showed me that what it was, and I don't know the years he was talking about. I would assume maybe, possibly as late as the 1950s or 60s. There were, say, like 8 or 9 remote monks who were practicing in the forest. Just on their own, living in their own hut, getting their own alms in seclusion. But that when an alert of a tiger came in the area, this was basically a fortified monastery where the doors were extremely heavy and could slide, and you could lock yourself into basically a tiger safe house. And so these remote monks would congregate in this tiger safe house as a way to prevent tiger attacks. And this was all of this has then been changed by the increased access of those wanting to get merits. So this alerted me to the idea of monks kind of being this inadvertent civilizing agent or colonial agent to for those who would then follow them, and not wanting to be followed, but their whole point of going away, they'd follow them into the wilderness, and then it would become less wilderness. And I mean, you could also go back to Ledi Sayadaw's example of how the Ledi monastery developed in what was a deep forest.
Yeah. So the king's first duty is dana, so merit making, and merit making is what kind of creates the social, collective sort of emergence. So a king without generosity, and this is why you see, of course, the military are all the time trying to show that they're generous, but of course they take the funds from whoever, and it's not their own money. Yeah. And anyway, it is not that meaningful, but they always have to pretend, at least, to be doing that in order to feel that they might be recognized by the people or legitimized in some way. So dana is very important, but even if you are together with somebody you feel you have a rapport with, and you say, "Oh, we get on so well, we must have shared drops of water in the past."
Right.
Yeah. Or patanzeshide.
Yeah.
And then it means we transcend our current differences. I may be Dutch, you may be Burmese, but it doesn't matter. But somewhere along the line, our actions have met together, and we've done something positive together, and that's now why we understand ourselves well, each other well, despite our differences. So it's a way of leveling difference. So merit is not just about establishing huge edifices or control mechanisms over other people, but it's also just simply the idea that in order to be selfless, donate selflessly with a selfless mind, that generates its own karma, and that's the reason why ultimately we end up meeting and being together and doing things together.
Just as that beautiful story of someone coming, a Dutch or a Burmese, in that moment sharing that, I couldn't help but think can that be extended to a Bamar and a Chin, or a Bamar and a Muslim, or a Bamar and a Shan, or a Kachin, or whatever?
It should be.
Yeah.
I think it should be. And there must be mechanisms whereby we can generate, the oppression, of course, is so immense. And I don't think that minorities will ever forgive the army for what it's doing. But neither will the Burma themselves, the Burmans themselves, that their army has oppressed everybody so badly.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a separate thing. The army is a separate thing. It's not specifically Burma, but it became Burmanized because originally the army was minorities against the Burma, right?
Yeah.
That's the colonial practice.
Yeah.
So now we have another practice, but the army remains very oppressive. But yes, what we're trying to do here too is to create an environment in Chiang Mai where some of the many refugees and they're all concerned with Myanmar. They're all fighting the system as it is mentally and in other ways. But how can you generate an environment whereby they can make a common cause? All the refugees can make a common cause. They're all suffering from the system.
Yeah.
And so somewhere along the line, we are trying to produce an environment where this is possible. So I'm part of some projects to do that. I'm very concerned about this, and I would not want the assertion of Buddhism as a topic to be standing in the way of a broader discourse that can address everybody on the issue of Myanmar. So we have to be more open about these issues.
Absolutely, and I've talked to a number of ethnic minorities who, when they talk about Buddhism, I can't tell you how many times I've heard something about some statement of, I really like what the Buddha taught. I really appreciate learning about this, and it's such a tragedy. It's so awful that the oppressive nature and domineering nature of how the military, and let's be honest, also some of the NLD over the years has used that as a hammer to bludgeon when some of those ideals and theories and practices are from some of the ethnics I spoke to. They find them inspirational, and they don't like the way that they're being used and applied by the state. But the actual doctrines themselves, they're friendly towards. So it really is quite a failure that's the way they're expressed.
That's the common question. How come that the most violent countries are Buddhist? It's a question we can ask, and one answer might be that if you don't have power over your people, like symbolic power, then you try to do it physically. So there may be a kind of paranoia that there is no system of control, whereas let's say in the monotheistic countries there is an element of control which largely happens through a common education, a common goal, common understanding, common religion to some extent. You develop this vision of largely, something in common. But here we have just this enormous divide where there is no commonality asserted at any point. Okay, we're all humans. Okay, that's maybe the common one. We're all humans, and maybe we should go back to basics and say, well, there are certain things in human behavior even before any religion appeared. If you talk about evolutionary history, you look, there were no states, no hierarchy, no writing. There was no surplus to argue over. Everybody hunted for the day, collected food for the day, and there were small communities. There was no legal system. There was just people understanding one another to some extent. So what you had is hunter-gathering, you had reciprocity systems, but you didn't have tribute. And now we have in Myanmar, we have a mandala system, which is very centralized, which is based on tribute and based on hierarchy. And then we got the Zomia system, which is based on reciprocity, egalitarianism, independence, and these two systems don't fit very nicely together. And the question you can ask is what's happening right now. And my view, I'm editing a book specifically with this introduction, is Zomia into the mandala, which is that currently the CDM movement and also all those who are fighting the current regime suggest that the mandala is at an end. There's no more respect for this kind of hierarchy, and that everybody is now becoming reciprocity oriented. To escape the control of this hierarchy, they have to divide responsibilities, and there can't be one leader who does everything. There are just lots of people who take independent responsibility for education, for finance, for defusing bombs, for governing their own societies, collectives, and so forth. And this suggests that they are not building the hierarchies that they used to have under the mandala, but actually they're realizing that much more flexible are the reciprocal arrangements between groups of people, and that this is actually working rather well compared to that sort of very inflexible hierarchical system, where if one leader fails, the whole system falls apart. With reciprocity, if one node fails, it is only one node, and there are many other reciprocal nodes. So you're no longer based on a server-client hierarchy where the whole system fails. You cannot get to your bank account, right? Here, there's always ways of getting around. And so the system that now politically is within even the rice-growing area, the valley, is largely a reciprocal model. And the question is whether that model is the model for the future or not. Whether perhaps Myanmar can change from a mandala into a more Zomia-like model of reciprocity.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on, and I thank you so much for your time. It's such an extensive conversation. I think it still has many different threads that can go, and maybe at a later time we can pull those, because I've enjoyed this so much. It's been such a long time coming for me to be able to have this conversation, and I'd like to invite you in your in this last prompt I'll give and last reflection is following up on the last thing you've said. We and looking at how we started looking at your 1990 thesis and examining these padi traditions, but then with that, you're concerned that perhaps there was an overemphasis on the Buddhist history and Buddhist culture of Burma at the expense of these different lived lives and experiences and traditions. And I want to highlight again just how much you are involved in doing what you can nowadays to support the democratic resistance and the aspirations for a better country, which is kind of a full circle from where you started, and that you do consider yourself very much an academic activist. And feel that, as you expressed before we started recording, feel that as an academic, this is very much not a time to be quiet and to just simply fall back into your studies, but a time when academics like you and Western academics with privilege, that there is this really clear responsibility to be able to use that background and that freedom to be able to do something. And so with all of those thoughts and themes in mind, as we wrap up, I'd invite you to give a final reflection on where we're at now in Myanmar and how you're involved and what you hope to see and think we might see.
Yeah, that's such a big question. One begins as a naive student, and you walk into a department in the university, and you say, well, I'm doing anthropology, what other thing can I do? Okay, maybe Thai, maybe Sinhalese, maybe Indonesian, maybe Burmese. Which language should I choose? You're just a naive 19-year-old, 20-year-old, and you say, okay, so Thai, so many students there, wow. Indonesian, so many students, wow. Burmese, only 3 teachers and no students at the time. And I thought, well, there's a Burmese professor there, he seemed very nice, and I thought, well, I'll take Burmese. But never did I think that I would end up in the situation where the reason at the time there were no students perpetuates today, in the sense that there were no students because there was no communication with Burma. It was like a non-entity.
Yeah.
Now it's ended up as one of the most disturbing regions in the world, which has exploded pretty much, and there's no way of putting things together easily again. There's a permanent, absolute change going on, and the question is, do we know what direction it's going, and what can we do to prevent it from getting worse? And that's very difficult, because where do you start, right? I mean, what do you do? So I think after 5 years in Mandalay, after 5 years in Mandalay, I got to know so many people, and they were all fired.
Is it hard to go back there?
It's my weakest point.
You're fine. You're fine. Take your time. I mean, thank you for showing your humanity here.
I'm editing a book called Thrice Under Fire, Ethnography Thrice Under Fire. And it has 10 contributors. All of whom had to escape the country, or at least escape there. They were fired as part of the civil disobedience movement, and they had to find a way of beginning a new life. 1/3 operates inside the urban areas. They have to hide because they were kicked out of their job because they were part of the civil disobedience movement, and they have to hide continuously. So one group is of that kind. Another group is in the liberated, well, not liberated area, but the area that gets bombed all the time, gets invaded all the time by the regime. So they're in that environment. And then there's 1/3 in Misot in Thailand. So all of them have risks to their lives, and they're doing academic research. It's Thrice Under Fire. What it means really is that in privileged universities like wherever I was before in the West and so forth, people have support from their university. They can do their research, and they talk about risks. Ooh, this is very risky. There's a war going on there. Do you really want to go there? And then they go there and they say, "Ooh, it was very risky, my field work, and I had a very dangerous moments in my time there." But nothing compares to these people.
Yeah. Oh. And their dedication must be so incredible.
And the problem is for them to make meaning of what they are experiencing when there's so much chaos. They've lost their family. They can't speak to their family because their family has to denounce them because they're dangerous to the regime. So the family even sometimes literally has to renounce them.
Yeah.
Their friends cannot be in touch with them because it's dangerous, because they're kind of contaminating, and they have to give information about them. They're forced to give information about them. So in all respects, they're refugees. They're fugitives. Dokhat there. They are carriers of suffering, as the Burmese concept of refugee goes. So despite that, they're all doing research for this project that we set up at the RCSD, and they've done some research for a year. They got some income from the RCSD as fellows, and they wrote this fieldwork research up. They're not all anthropologists, but the majority are. One is a political scientist, one is a historian. And they write their account, which is, we were trying to make sense of this as a particular event in the history of scholarship. And I decided that it was better to call it about methodology and ethics, than the outcome wasn't as important as the methodology and the ethics. They had to operate almost like James Bond, right? Because they had to hide. And they were addressing people who were themselves vulnerable. So if they collected data on vulnerable people and they got into the hands of the military, then that would be causing not only them but also the people a lot of risk. Yeah. So in a Western context, you could not possibly justify ethically such kind of research, and it would never happen. Yeah. Yeah. But there, for themselves, it is the only way to make meaning of a very bad situation in their country. And to find a solution, they feel they have to understand in the best way, possible way, what's happening. And how do you best understand it is to research it. So for them, the only solution as a political activist, but also as a researcher, as an academic, they couldn't be an academic with... They are not allowed to be an academic because of the political situation. So they have to redress that even alone. So to redress that. So I talk about Thrice Under Fire. I edited this with a colleague called Elliot Lodge. And we decided that it should be thrice under fire. So once under fire is they themselves. Okay, so they are in a vulnerable situation. They are being pursued by the regime. And yet they're doing the research. That's once under fire. The other under fire is they're dealing with a community that is themselves under fire, is being watched and oppressed by the regime. And then they don't have the support of an institution, so they have no way of covering themselves. So they're thrice under fire. So this idea that they're doing this research in order to understand the conditions in which their country finds itself, and in order to come to some kind of longer term, feed it into some kind of solution for the longer term, as civil disobedience practitioners, is very moving, and quite an achievement for them to have completed this as part of their fellowship of the RCSD. So I got quite involved in that as a concept, and that should be coming out over the next few months as a book.
What does that mean to you?
It is very meaningful to me. I feel it's probably more meaningful than anything else I've done.
Why is that?
So far, I believe that the scholarship that I'm doing has less urgency than the kind of work that they can do for their own community. And so this is where, in a sense, my scholarship, I can support them with what I'm doing, but I see it as their most urgent work. And it's like a lifetime's work which they have sacrificed.
Yeah. And so you are really invested in this Burma story and where it goes.
Well, how can you not? You cannot reverse out. Oh. Once you enter into this cave, in a sense, do you just want to be you want to treat it like a holiday? Then obviously you're not going to stay. But if you want to go for the long haul, you have to commit yourself to join them in this project. And I don't think you can pursue your own scholarship while the country is occupied in this manner. This is not possible. So the question is, why do you ever study Burmese? If you want to study Burmese, then than to be committed for the long haul. And it may not be what you expect. It may not be just a life of leisurely scholarship or pleasant discoveries. It may actually be more complicated than that.
You've given a lot, but has it also transformed you?
I think I'm not the same person that I was, that's for sure. But I don't know exactly how yet. I spend most of my time now addressing these issues. I do it on a voluntary basis, so I give half of my time as a volunteer since 2015. And it's just the nature of it has changed. It used to be just teaching anthropology, English, and so forth. And gradually it's become much more facilitating ways for scholars to express themselves from the area. And I think that's where I'm at now. And it's a very difficult time now because, in a sense, with the icon of democracy having disappeared, America, right? And then China being very powerful in the midst of everything. The sense of victory is not so great. Even if they overcome the army, we have a big mess on our hands, and the Chinese are preventing it. So Chinese are quite happy with imbalance in the country. It serves them. So it's not going to issue into some kind of resolution. So what I feel is that somewhere someone should work towards creating a space for dialogue among those who are interested in the country. And I think Chiang Mai is very good in the sense that we have this International Burma Studies Conference, which is attended by all the budding Burmese scholars from all over the world, wherever they find themselves. So I think this is a good place to get people to think, but it shouldn't just be based on your own affiliation to your own group. It should also be like a common discourse about how to prevent this in future and how to put in place a better system. And I'm not sure that our conversation is at this level yet. It's mostly about enclave thinking. It's my group, my religion, my ethnicity. Whereas if it could be opened up to be more broad, then that might have a greater long-term life, and it might actually play a role when things calm down. And I think these conferences are useful. So, yes.
Are you hopeful?
It's very hard to be hopeful when... at times I feel hopeful, but because it's lasting such a long time and there have been so many people hopeful for so long and they all in the end died trying.
Oh.
And so in a sense there are whole generations who've not been fulfilled in their aspirations.
Yeah.
So there's no guarantee that we are not one of this generation. I mean, if you hold it out as a spiritual tradition that's alive, maybe you see hope, but if you see it as a country that is meeting its probably darkest hour, then it doesn't look so very hopeful. There's only hope insofar as people work hard to address these things, and if they are, then there's hope. So during these conferences, getting all these people together to work on all these topics and bringing out publications and so forth, that gives hope. We just have to wait and see, I guess. I'm terrible when I talk about this. It's just hopeless. I cannot. I'm sure you have the same problem at times.
Yeah, that's why I asked the questions.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So I have here one. This is, this is the title of the book.
Wow.
So it's really it's really making a point about ethnography, that we've been very privileged with our concept of ethnography in the past. But when you look at this kind of ethnography, this totally puts things upside down.
Yeah.
But the idea of these layers of risk that you go through when you do fieldwork in all these different settings with different risks. You may be an exile abroad, but you're undocumented. You're continuously being shaken down as an ATM, and you might be sent back. And then there's the ones in between who have all these other kinds of risks. They may be part of a community defending itself, but they're being attacked from the air, and they're being invaded every once in a while, and they fear for their lives. And then the ones who are in hiding in the cities. So this kind of is an expression of what. And then I've got another one that I'm doing as well. I'm doing 2 at the moment, contributed to a third. This one is really about the mandala in Zomia into mandala. Let's have a look. Oh yeah, this is the one. Just to give you an idea. So this is really some output from the conference, and there were some are writing about banking be decentralized, peer-to-peer, and education peer-to-peer. So everything is becoming decentralized in order to survive, because you cannot. The centralized systems are there to oppress you, but the reciprocal arrangements are there to enhance you. Yeah. And so people choose not to be centralized, because basically if you have your bank in a centralized system, they can just take your account away and take it for themselves. So it's as bad as that. Yeah. So in this sense, I'm kind of saying that the mandala is being redefined in the current era. So it's no longer Zomia versus mandala, but Zomia into the mandala, just to play with ideas. Right. Yeah. So. That these are the things I get busy with, and I've set up a project called Streetwise, which is in Mesot. It's for the conscription escapees. So we've got about 160 young people on the border who live there in isolation, pretty much. So we organize workshops and things for them. And there's something called Migrant College, which is a range of teachers that we've set up from the anthropology department who are taking initiatives to teach. So it is them organizing themselves to teach their own people in the way that they want. So I set it up under the RCSD. So they have a little bit of a constitution, they have a bank account, and we send them money to do projects and things like that. So those are 2 projects that I'm involved in. And the third one is this idea of open sky thinking. So I work with Myanmar, who is a Mon kind of politician, and he was formerly a fellow. And he said, I'm tired with all this enclave thinking. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. So we decided to set up a declaration for a just and inclusive Burma at the last conference. But it didn't materialize because we only got the idea very late. So we're now developing that idea of a declaration by the conference. Basically, mother and apple pie, it's saying it's not making any political statement, but basically saying the state of Myanmar affairs as is seen by this community at this conference. So it can be cited by others. And my idea is that declarations always precede constitutions. The Declaration of Human Rights, right? They were incorporated into constitutions. You can make a declaration as a people, as a group, and then that reverberates because people can cite it. This group of Myanmar scholars had this to say about their country. And then you can use that as a way of bringing in funding for particular issues. So that's the idea of a declaration. So I developed that idea together with this Myanmar, and now we are developing it for the next one, because the last one we couldn't finalize it because it was a complex operation.
So that's been quite a life journey, and thank you for taking the time to share all the aspects of it on here.
My pleasure. It was a good way of thinking back, which I don't often do. I normally go from day to day, and you trigger a lot of thoughts about the past. I may not have always been very coherent, but I try to think through answers to what you ask for. Some of the questions are unexpected, and so I haven't rehearsed any answer. So I apologize if I got anything wrong, but it was a fruitful event. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Given the importance of the topics we cover, it's my firm commitment and guarantee that our podcast feed will never sit behind a paywall, and that all of our episodes will be freely available for all to access. However, just because the episodes are free does not mean there is no cost with producing them. Truth be told, it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge to keep afloat from month to month, and sometimes our limited resources prevent us from taking on the type of content that we'd really like to pursue. So, if you found today's episode of value and would like to help us continue to produce more interviews just like this one, we would greatly appreciate a contribution. You can offer up a small recurring donation through Patreon or PayPal, or explore our other donation options by going to insightmyanmar.org/donation. We also invite you to consider stepping up your level of support by becoming a member. You can learn more about this by going to insightmyanmar.org/membership. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Bodha-batha nangkaya unyana dadu ya dalam diri ganeza demana Weikza Sayadaw besaya. Oba yarana da yarana ngana yarana ya da yarana bodha-batha yarana mano dadu.